Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity takes the scenic path and history becomes a gentle companion to your evening. Tonight, I'd like to invite you to settle in and drift with me into a story that begins long before us, but somehow still lingers in our bones and in our myths. It's a story about water, about a planet that once seemed to almost drown in its own melting. Imagine standing at the edge of a world 12,000 years ago, the air still cool with the breath of the Ice Age, the seas restless, the land reshaping itself with every season. Tonight we'll be wandering through what the Earth was like after the Great Flood, the mysterious period when the ice sheets melted, the oceans surged, and humanity had to find its footing again on a changed planet. But before we wander too far into that past, I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Maybe you're close to the sea, maybe far inland, maybe you can hear rain tapping against your window, or perhaps you're surrounded by a still, quiet night. Fitting, isn't it, to be speaking about floods and waters when somewhere, at this very moment, rivers and tides are moving, reshaping their own landscapes in miniature. What's it like where you are right now? And as always, if you find this journey soothing, if it helps you unwind, or if it sparks that quiet sense of wonder, I'd be grateful if you gave this video a like or even subscribed, because it helps this little space reach others who might also need a calm voice to carry them into rest. Now let's find our place on that ancient Earth, 12,000 years ago. When we think of floods, we might picture a sudden storm, a river swelling beyond its banks, streets turned into streams. But what happened back then wasn't just a storm or a single river running wild. It was the slow, immense undoing of an ice age. Vast glaciers that had once blanketed continents were melting. They had locked away enormous amounts of the world's water for tens of thousands of years, pressing down on the land with unimaginable weight. And when those sheets of ice began to retreat, the world shifted. Seas rose, valleys filled, and shorelines moved inland, swallowing forests, plains, and anything that had lived or walked there before. Imagine entire coastlines erased not in a day, but steadily, relentlessly, year after year. A farm here, a hunting ground there, until whole regions vanished beneath the encroaching waves. It wasn't sudden the way a movie might portray it, but it was no less dramatic. To the people alive at the time, whose lives were lived close to the land, it must have felt like the earth itself was restless. They would have watched familiar paths disappear, the edges of rivers widen, islands form where none had been before. A sense of impermanence must have seeped into daily life. Imagine walking a trail your parents once knew well, only to find it gone, replaced by a marsh or a widening bay. Imagine losing not just a home, but a landscape itself. The flood is often spoken of in myths and legends. From Mesopotamia to India, from the Americas to the Pacific Islands, stories of a great deluge appear again and again. While the details vary, the memory is the same. A world overwhelmed by water, people seeking safety on higher ground, and survivors carrying the story forward. Myths have a way of preserving experiences that are too vast or too frightening to capture in ordinary words. Perhaps the myths of floods are the way our ancestors remembered the slow catastrophe of their own rising seas. Perhaps what seemed like the anger of gods was really the earth reshaping itself at the end of the Ice Age. But even stripped of myth, the science is just as powerful. Around 12,000 years ago, sea levels rose hundreds of feet, compared to what they had been during the height of the Ice Age. That meant that coastlines looked nothing like they do today. If you were to stand where modern cities now rise, London, New York, Tokyo, you would have been standing miles inland back then, with the sea far away. After the flood, those coastlines moved closer, and much of what was once habitable land now lies beneath the waves. Archaeologists suspect that countless ancient sites are still buried offshore, drowned by this post-glacial sea rise waiting to be discovered. The world after the flood wasn't just wetter, it was warmer. As the glaciers melted, they not only released water, they changed the climate. Rivers swelled with glacial melt, carving valleys deeper, carrying fertile soil across plains, spreading nutrients that would later support agriculture. The earth became greener in many places, forests spreading into lands once locked in ice. The air carried more moisture, storms shifted, and ecosystems transformed. It was a time of endings, yes, but also of beginnings. For humans, these changes were not abstract. They shaped migration, survival, and the birth of cultures. Entire groups of people had to move as their homes disappeared under rising waters. Some went inland. Some followed new rivers. Some adapted to life near the expanding seas, learning to fish and sail. It was a time of adaptation, of ingenuity, and of resilience. Perhaps this is why flood stories often end not just with destruction, but with renewal. Out of loss came new ways of living. Out of drowning came rebirth. If you close your eyes and picture it, you might imagine a family sitting near a fire, on the edge of what had once been dry land. The night is quiet except for the steady lap of water against the shore. Their grandparents remember a village that once stood farther out, now swallowed by the sea. Their children will never know it existed. For them, the water has always been there. That is how history works when nature moves faster than memory. The flood wasn't uniform. Different regions of the earth experienced it in different ways. In some areas, like the North American Great Lakes, ice melt created vast inland seas, reshaping the map entirely. In others, like the Mediterranean, rivers swelled and poured into basins, flooding valleys that had been dry for millennia. In places like Southeast Asia, low-lying plains were lost to the ocean, while islands grew smaller, scattered remnants of once larger continents. Every culture, every community, would have had its own story of what the flood took and what it left behind. It's worth pausing here, because when we think about 12,000 years ago, it can feel impossibly distant. But in terms of human history, it isn't that far. Our ancestors were already skilled toolmakers, artists, storytellers. They painted caves, shaped ornaments, built shelters. They loved, they raised children, they grieved. To them, the rising waters weren't a geological event, they were part of daily life, like weather, like hunger, like hope. And when you imagine it that way, the flood isn't just history, it's lived experience, as real and raw as anything we feel today. So what was Earth like after the Great Flood? It was a planet in transition, where every horizon seemed to shift, where maps were redrawn not by hand but by water. It was the end of an age and the beginning of another. And as the land changed, so too did the creatures upon it, from the mammoths fading away to the humans stepping cautiously into a new world. And that, perhaps, is where our journey truly begins. When we speak of memory, we often think of our own lives, moments kept like small treasures in the mind, fading or sharpening depending on how often we revisit them. But there are memories that live longer than a single lifetime, memories that slip into stories, myths and traditions, carried forward not by one person, but by entire communities across generations. The story of a great flood belongs to this kind of memory. What happened 12,000 years ago wasn't just a change in climate or geography. For the people who lived through it, it became a marker, a boundary between the world before and the world after. And when something reshapes the very land under your feet, it doesn't fade easily from human imagination. It lingers, retold around fires, passed down as warnings, preserved in song and story until it becomes something bigger than memory, something close to myth. Everywhere you look in human culture, you find echoes of the flood. It's there in the story of Noah in the Hebrew Bible, where rains fell for 40 days and 40 nights until only those on the ark survived. It's there in the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest written tales we possess, where the gods send a flood to cleanse the world, and one man is told to build a vessel to preserve life. It's in Hindu traditions, where the god Vishnu, in the form of a fish, warns Manu of a coming deluge, guiding him to build a boat that carries seeds of life. It's told among the Hopi, the Ojibwe, and countless other indigenous peoples of North America, where waters rose and only those who listened to the animals or to divine messengers survived. Even in places as far apart as Polynesia and Scandinavia, stories of overwhelming waters are part of cultural memory. Now, it's true that floods happen everywhere. Rivers overflow, storms bring surges, tsunamis strike without warning. But the universality of the flood story suggests something larger. Not just local disasters remembered, but an echo of a global event, a time when waters did not simply rise for a season, but remade the map of the earth itself. For communities 12,000 years ago, living close to coasts and rivers, the sea level rise after the Ice Age must have seemed like the world itself was drowning. Even if the changes were gradual on a geological scale, for human lives, the difference between a safe home and a lost one might be a single generation. That is more than enough to etch a memory deep into culture. Imagine a community living along what is now the continental shelf, back when it was dry land. To them, the shore might have been miles away, a horizon of salt air and tides. Over the years, they watched the shoreline creep closer. Fields where they gathered food became marshes. Burial grounds were swallowed by brackish water. Trees that once stood tall ended up half drowned. The elders told stories of where the land used to be, and children grew up hearing of places they would never walk because the sea had claimed them. To us, this is data. Sea levels rising, coastlines shifting. To them, it was personal. It was the loss of sacred places, hunting grounds, homes, ancestors. When we look at myths through this lens, they become less like fantasy and more like cultural records, imperfect but deeply meaningful. The flood at the edge of memory may not describe a single storm, a single year of rain, but rather the long, slow catastrophe of post-Ice Age flooding. And the way those stories are told, through gods, through punishments, through survival, reflects how people made sense of what they could not otherwise explain. Why did the waters rise? Why did the world change? In a time before geology, before science as we know it, the answers had to come through story. It's striking how often these flood myths centre not just on destruction, but on survival. There is always someone who listens, someone who builds the boat, someone who climbs to higher ground. The flood is not the end. It is a trial, after which humanity begins again. In that sense, these stories are less about despair and more about resilience. They say, yes, the waters rose, yes, the world changed, but life continued. We endured. And perhaps that is why they were worth telling over and over, because they carried not just fear of the flood, but hope for what came after. The idea of cultural memory brings us to something important. How do we know which myths connect to real events? Archaeologists and anthropologists look for patterns. When a story appears across many cultures in distant places, when it describes not just vague catastrophe, but details that align with geology or climate data, it hints that the memory may be rooted in reality. For example, in Australia, indigenous oral traditions describe coastlines and landmarks that are now submerged but were once above sea level during the Ice Age. These stories were passed down for thousands of years, long before written records, yet they match geological reconstructions of what the land looked like. That suggests oral memory can survive far longer than we sometimes imagine, preserving the outlines of events like floods across immense spans of time. So, when we hear stories of a great deluge, perhaps we shouldn't dismiss them as just myth. Perhaps they are fractured, stylized records of what life was like after the glaciers melted. The flood at the edge of memory may be the human way of keeping hold of an event too vast to fully comprehend, but too important to forget. Picture again a small group, thousands of years ago, telling their children why the world looks the way it does, why the coastlines seem new, why the rivers run wider, why shells can be found far inland. They would have explained it in the terms they had. The gods were angry, or the spirits decided to wash the land clean. The stories carried warning, but also meaning. They help the next generation make sense of a world that seemed to be constantly shifting. In that sense, the flood at the edge of memory was not just about the past, but about teaching how to survive the future. And these memories didn't just stay within communities, they travelled. As people migrated to new lands, they carried their flood stories with them. Over time, these stories adapted to new landscapes, new gods, new languages. The core idea remained. Waters once rose and changed everything. But the details shifted depending on where the story was told. In a desert culture, the flood might be framed as an unimaginable punishment. In a river culture, it might be seen as a recurring cycle. In an island culture, it might be part of an origin story. The universality lies not in identical details, but in the shared memory of overwhelming waters. What makes this all the more fascinating is how these myths intersect with the science we now uncover. Sediment cores from ocean floors show sudden pulses of fresh water entering the seas during glacial melt. Geological records reveal drowned river valleys now forming the seabeds of our coastlines. Fossils of plants and animals are found beneath the waves, reminders of lands once above water. Each of these discoveries matches in its own way the memory preserved in stories. It is as if science is slowly catching up to what human culture has carried in its imagination all along. There is also the question of why flood myths are remembered more vividly than other kinds of disasters. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, droughts. All of these would have been part of human experience. Yet it is the flood that dominates global mythology. Perhaps it is because water is both life and danger. We cannot survive without it, yet too much of it can sweep away everything. Floods are also visible in a way droughts are not. You can watch the waters rise, watch the land disappear. The transformation is undeniable, and when that transformation is not just temporary but permanent, as it was 12,000 years ago, it leaves a scar not just on the land but on human memory. So when we speak of the flood at the edge of memory, we are really speaking of two things: the geological reality of post-Ice Age sea level rise, and the cultural reality of how humans remembered it. One is written in rocks and shorelines, the other in stories and myths. Together they form a double record of the same event, one natural, one human. It's worth considering how those ancient memories still shape us. Even today, flood myths resonate. They are retold in religious traditions, in literature, in movies. They carry moral weight, warnings about arrogance, about ignoring signs, about renewal after destruction. They remind us that water has always been both a gift and a threat, and they remind us that no matter how advanced we become, we are still vulnerable to the forces of nature, just as our ancestors were 12,000 years ago. In a way, listening to these stories is like listening to the Earth itself. The planet doesn't speak in words, but in changes. Rising seas, shifting climates, growing forests, vanishing ice. Humans translate those changes into narratives, and sometimes those narratives last far longer than we expect, bridging the gap between ancient experience and modern science. And so, as we drift deeper into this story, we find ourselves standing not just in the past, but at the crossroads of memory and geology. The flood is at once a fact of nature and a fact of culture, remembered across continents, told in countless voices, yet always pointing back to the same truth. There was a time when waters rose, and the world was never the same again. When the Ice Age began to loosen its grip on the planet, it didn't happen with a single crack or a single thaw. It happened with a slow but relentless retreat, an undoing of something that had been built over tens of thousands of years. Imagine sheets of ice taller than mountains stretching across continents, pressing down on valleys, covering everything in silence and cold. For generations, that was the world people knew. Then, slowly, the balance tipped. Temperatures inched upward, and what had been frozen for ages began to melt. That melting was not just a quiet drip of water-down stone. It was a cascade that reshaped Earth itself. The retreat of the ice was the trigger for what we now call the Great Flood. When those glaciers melted, they released staggering amounts of water back into the oceans. The seas swelled, creeping inland, reshaping coastlines in ways that no one could ignore. Entire land bridges that had once connected continents began to sink beneath the waves. The Bering Land Bridge, for example, that stretch of earth that once connected Siberia to Alaska, was slowly swallowed by the rising seas. For countless generations, humans and animals had crossed it, spreading across continents, hunting and following herds. After the ice retreated, that bridge was gone, leaving the Americas separated from Asia in a way that remains to this day. Europe too changed. What had once been dry plains between Britain and mainland Europe, an area known to archaeologists as Doggerland, was gradually inundated. Villages, forests and hunting grounds disappeared, until only the North Sea remained. People living there would have watched their familiar landscapes dissolve, forcing them to move inland or adapt to new coastlines. Even now, fishermen sometimes pull up remnants of trees, bones or tools from those drowned lands. It's a reminder that what is now sea was once home, and the retreat of the ice didn't just raise water levels, it changed the weight of the Earth's crust itself. Glaciers had pressed down on the land like massive hands, flattening valleys and holding the surface in place. When the ice melted, the land slowly began to rebound, a process called isostatic adjustment. In some places, this meant new hills and shorelines appeared, even as the sea rose. It must have been disorienting. Rivers shifted their courses, lakes expanded or drained, coastlines redrew themselves in the span of a few lifetimes. For the people living then, the world was not stable. It was alive, restless, unpredictable. Scientists estimate that during the height of the Ice Age, sea levels were more than 120 metres lower than they are today. That means vast areas of what is now seafloor were once dry land. As the ice retreated, all that space was reclaimed by the ocean. Over the course of several thousand years, seas rose steadily, sometimes with sudden surges when massive glacial lakes drained in catastrophic bursts. One such event, known as the draining of Lake Agassiz in North America, may have sent so much fresh water into the oceans that it disrupted global climate for centuries. These pulses of meltwater weren't just local. They affected weather patterns, ocean currents, and temperatures across the entire planet. Imagine standing on the edge of one of those glacial lakes, a body of water larger than all of today's Great Lakes combined. To the people of the time, it would have seemed endless, a mirror of sky stretching beyond sight. Then, perhaps in a single season, an ice dam failed. The water thundered out, flooding valleys, tearing through forests, carving canyons that remain visible today. Downstream, rivers swelled beyond recognition. The surge raced to the oceans, raising sea levels in a matter of months. For people living anywhere near its path, it would have been a cataclysm. Not myth, not metaphor, a lived disaster of unimaginable scale. The retreat of the ice also opened new pathways for life. As glaciers pulled back, they left behind freshly scraped land, raw and barren at first, but soon colonized by plants. Mosses, shrubs and grasses spread, followed by forests. Animals returned too, herds of reindeer, bison, and later species that could thrive in warmer climates. Humans followed, adapting their ways of life to these changing environments. Where once they had hunted on tundra, they now learned to fish in rivers, to gather in forests, to adapt to landscapes that seemed to change within a generation. But the rising seas were relentless. Year after year the water crept higher. To us, a few centimetres may not sound like much, but over a lifetime those centimetres add up to the loss of fields, homes, entire communities. Oral traditions might have remembered grandparents who farmed or hunted where now only waves lap. Children grew up hearing stories of land that no longer existed. This slow loss carried with it not just practical hardship, but a kind of grief. Imagine knowing that the place where your ancestors lived, the places they considered sacred, were gone forever beneath the waves. That kind of loss imprints itself deeply. The Earth's transformation during this time was global. In Asia, the vast plains that had stretched far out from the coastlines disappeared under the rising seas. In the Pacific, islands shrank, forcing communities to move or adapt. In South America, glaciers in the Andes retreated, feeding massive rivers that carried nutrients into the Amazon basin, fueling the growth of one of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet. Everywhere, the story was the same. Ice retreating, oceans rising, land changing. And yet, for all its destruction, the retreat of the ice also set the stage for the world we know today. Without those rising seas, many of the coastlines that now define our maps would not exist. Without the redistribution of water, many of the climates we live in would be entirely different. The retreat of the ice was both a loss and a creation, an ending and a beginning. It's easy to think of the past as static, as if the world 12,000 years ago was simply waiting for us to arrive. But in reality, it was dynamic, shifting, unstable. People alive then had to live not in spite of change, but within it, adjusting constantly as the ground itself moved beneath them. Their resilience was remarkable. They carried tools, stories, and skills into new lands, always finding ways to endure. The retreat of the ice and the rise of the oceans tested humanity, but it also forged adaptability that would become one of our greatest strengths. Consider, too, how this period shaped human imagination. To watch seas rise, to see land vanish, to witness glaciers retreat must have given the impression that Earth was not fixed, but alive. That impression found its way into myths of gods reshaping the land, of waters rising at divine command, of worlds ending and beginning anew. The physical world fed directly into the spiritual, because how else could you explain forces so much greater than human will? The retreat of the ice and the rise of the seas were not just natural events. They became the canvas upon which humans painted their earliest understanding of power, change, and survival. If you stood on one of those ancient shores, watching the tide creep higher each year, you might not have thought of it in terms of melting glaciers or global climate. You would have thought of it in terms of home, of where to gather food, of where to shelter, of where your children might live. That human scale of understanding is what transformed geological events into memory, and memory into myth. And that is why, even now, we can still feel a connection to those ancient floods. They remind us that we too live in a world that changes, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, but always in ways that demand adaptation. And so, as the ice retreated and the oceans rose, Earth was remade. Not in a single moment, but in countless ones, spread across generations. A world that had been locked in cold gave way to warmth. A planet that had been divided by glaciers became open and flowing. The maps we would one day draw began to take shape, not by human hands, but by the steady persistence of water. And humanity, small in number but rich in resilience, learned to walk through this shifting world, carrying stories that still echo in our imaginations today. When we think about the world today, we take coastlines for granted, as if the line where land meets sea has always been fixed. Maps show them with neat precision, blue meeting green, as though they've always belonged exactly where they are. But 12,000 years ago, those boundaries were far from permanent. As the ice retreated and the oceans rose, coastlines shifted in ways that would have felt both sudden and permanent to the people living then. Land that had been walked on, farmed and worshipped disappeared. Rivers that once led to fertile valleys now emptied into salt water. Islands appeared where there had once been hills, and whole plains sank beneath waves. The drowned coastlines became silent testaments to the power of water, reshaping the world in ways both subtle and overwhelming. One of the most striking examples lies beneath the North Sea. Today, that stretch of ocean is busy with ships and fishing boats, but hidden below lies a lost land known to archaeologists as Doggerland. During the Ice Age, Doggerland was a vast plain, rich with rivers, lakes, forests and wildlife. It connected what we now call Britain to mainland Europe. making it possible for people and animals to cross freely. It wasn't just a barren landscape, it was home. Small communities lived there, hunting red deer, fishing in rivers, and gathering plants in meadows that are now lost beneath the sea. For thousands of years, Doggerland thrived. Then, as the seas rose, it began to vanish. Year after year, the shoreline crept inland. Villages were abandoned, paths were forgotten. Eventually, the land was swallowed entirely, leaving only memories carried inland by those who fled. Today, trawlers still drag up bones, antlers, and tools from the seabed, proof that a world once vibrant now lies drowned and silent. Doggerland is not unique. All around the planet, similar stories unfolded. In Southeast Asia, a vast plain known as Sunderland connected many of the islands we know today, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, to the Asian mainland. Back then, rivers flowed across fertile valleys, and coastal plains stretched for miles. Rising seas transformed that landscape into the scattered islands of Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia. What is now one of the most complex archipelagos on Earth was once a continuous stretch of land. For people living there, the loss would have been dramatic. Ancestral lands vanished beneath waves, and the familiar connections between places were broken. Communities that had once been neighbours across fields and rivers became separated by seas, changing migration, trade, and culture forever. The Persian Gulf tells a similar story. At the height of the Ice Age, it was not a sea, but a broad river valley, watered by the Tigris, Euphrates, and other rivers. It may have been one of the lushest regions on Earth, a fertile refuge for early humans. As the seas rose, the valley flooded, transforming into the Gulf we know today. For those living along its rivers, the flood would not have been a single event, but a creeping inevitability. Villages once set comfortably inland found themselves at the edge of rising waters, then beneath them. It's no wonder that so many Mesopotamian flood myths speak of waters swallowing the world, because for them, it did. Farther east, in India, the Gulf of Kambat holds submerged ruins that suggest ancient settlements now beneath the waves. Whether those ruins are truly remnants of early cities or natural formations is still debated, but the idea of lost civilizations beneath the sea continues to capture imagination. After all, if so much land was drowned 12,000 years ago, how many of our earliest communities might have been erased? How many stories were lost with them? In Japan, similar evidence lies offshore. Submerged structures near Yonaguni, shaped by either natural forces or human hands, stand as haunting reminders of coastlines that once lay far beyond today's shores. Divers explore what looks like steps, terraces, and walls, as if a forgotten city sleeps beneath the ocean. While scientists continue to debate the origins of these formations, the symbolism remains the same. Drowned coastlines hold secrets, fragments of lives once lived on land we can no longer walk. The Americas too hold their drowned worlds. Along the Atlantic coast, what is now continental shelf was once dry land, where mammoths and mastodons roamed and humans followed. In Florida, underwater caves contain skeletal remains of early peoples, evidence that coastlines have shifted dramatically since they lived there. In South America, regions that are now low-lying coasts were once plains, later submerged by the relentless rise of water. The drowned coastlines stretch across the globe, from the Caribbean to the Pacific, each carrying its own story of a loss. But these lost lands weren't simply erased. Their disappearance reshaped human history. When people were forced inland, they carried their knowledge with them, influencing cultures farther away from the sea. Displacement brought new interactions, new communities, and new stories. The drowned coastlines became more than vanished land. They became the catalyst for change. People adapted to new environments, learned to live with new resources, and developed new ways of thinking. The memory of what was lost became embedded in myths, while the reality of adaptation forged new paths for survival. the psychological impact of losing coastlines cannot be overstated. For cultures that saw land as sacred, the drowning of ancestral ground would have been devastating. Burial sites, sacred groves, and gathering places disappeared. Imagine standing on a shoreline knowing that beneath the waves lay the bones of your ancestors, unreachable, forever cut off by the sea. That sense of separation, of something once permanent now lost, must have shaped cultural identities in ways we can still feel in the flood myths and spiritual traditions that followed. And yet, humans are resilient. Where land disappeared, they found ways to endure. Some became seafarers, learning to navigate the new waters. Others turned inland, reshaping agriculture and settlement around rivers and lakes instead of coasts. In places like the Pacific, the rise of the ocean may have been the very spark that led to the extraordinary seafaring traditions of island cultures who learned to read waves, stars and winds to cross vast distances. In this way, the drowned coastlines did not only take, they also gave, challenging people to adapt in ways that expanded human possibility. Scientists studying these drowned lands use sonar, sediment cores, and underwater archaeology to reconstruct the past. Each fragment tells part of the story. Layers of silt show when rivers once flowed across plains. Buried peat bogs reveal where forests stood. Fossils of animals and plants paint pictures of ecosystems now gone. Together, they confirm what myths had preserved. The world was not always as it is now. Seas have risen, lands have drowned, coastlines have shifted. What we think of as permanent is, in reality, fleeting. And perhaps that is why the drowned coastlines still capture imagination today. They remind us that Earth is never finished. It reshapes itself constantly, sometimes slowly, sometimes dramatically. What is dry land now may one day lie beneath the waves. What is sea today may one day be revealed again. The drowned coastlines are both history and prophecy, showing us not just where the water once was, but where it may go again. Imagine walking on one of those lost plains 12,000 years ago. The air is cool but warming, the land rich with game, rivers winding lazily toward a distant sea. Your family hunts, gathers, and builds shelters. The elders tell stories of the spirits of the land, the animals, the sky. And then, season by season, you watch the sea creep closer. The horizon shifts. Landmarks vanish. One day, you walk the same trail your grandparents knew, only to find it underwater. The world feels smaller and yet more uncertain. That sense of impermanence, of change beyond control, becomes part of your worldview. It shapes how you see the land, how you tell stories, how you raise your children, and in time it becomes part of the myths that survive long after the land itself has disappeared. The drowned coastlines are still there, silent beneath the waves, holding stories we can only piece together. They remind us that Earth's history is not static, that civilizations can rise and fall not only by their own actions, but by the shifting hand of nature itself. And they remind us that for all our maps and boundaries, the line between land and sea is never fixed. It moves with time, with climate, with the slow persistence of change. 12,000 years ago, entire worlds were drowned, and yet humanity endured, carrying forward the memory of what was lost, reshaping life on the shores that remained. When the ice sheets pulled back, they didn't just release water into the oceans, they reshaped the very veins of the continents. The retreat left behind scars, hollows and basins, and into those basins poured meltwater, rain, and runoff, creating lakes and rivers where none had existed before. In some places the land was scoured so deeply by glaciers that it formed the cradles of freshwater seas. In others, the immense weight of ice had pressed the ground down, and when that weight lifted, the depressions filled with water, leaving behind landscapes that still define regions today. Earth, after the flood, wasn't just a world of rising oceans. It became a planet laced with new waterways, an interconnected system of rivers and lakes that carried life, sediment, and memory. The North American continent offers one of the clearest examples. As glaciers retreated from what is now Canada and the northern United States, they left behind vast meltwater lakes. One of the greatest was Lake Agassiz, a body of water so large it dwarfed anything we know today. At its peak, Lake Agassiz stretched over hundreds of thousands of square kilometres, larger than all of today's Great Lakes combined. Imagine a freshwater sea covering the heart of a continent, its shores reaching horizons so distant that those standing on one side could not see the other. To the people of the time, it would have seemed endless, a new inland ocean in the middle of the land. But these giant lakes were not stable. They were held in place by the remains of ice sheets, by ridges of moraine, and by fragile barriers that could shift or collapse. When one of those barriers failed, the results were catastrophic. Glacial lake outburst floods roared across the land, carrying with them billions of tons of water. Valleys were gouged, canyons carved, soil stripped away. The Missoula floods in the Pacific Northwest of North America are one such legacy. At the end of the Ice Age, an enormous lake formed in Montana behind an ice dam. When that dam gave way, water surged across Washington state, ripping up earth, creating giant channels, and scouring the landscape into shapes that can still be seen today: dry waterfalls, immense ripple marks, and scablands that tell the story of water moving with unimaginable force. For people who may have lived nearby, the sound and sight of such a flood would have been overwhelming. It was not a trickle or a stream, it was the earth itself in motion. Elsewhere, as glaciers withdrew, they created the beginnings of what we now know as the Great Lakes. Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie and Ontario are all children of the Ice Age, born when retreating ice left behind deep basins. Over thousands of years, those basins filled with meltwater, shaping ecosystems, providing routes for migration, and later becoming lifelines for human cultures. Imagine being among the first humans to approach those lakes, vast mirrors of sky and water, rich with fish, surrounded by forests growing in the newly thawed soil. For them, these lakes were not just resources, they were worlds of their own, sources of food, of transport, of stories. In Europe, the story was similar. Scandinavia, once buried under kilometres of ice, became a land of rivers and fjords as the glaciers melted. Deep valleys filled with seawater, creating the fjords of Norway, while countless smaller lakes dotted Finland and Sweden, earning Finland the name Land of 1,000 Lakes. These waters became arteries for life, guiding movement, providing fish, and carving the identity of the land itself. To the first people returning north as the ice retreated, these lakes and rivers must have seemed like gifts left behind by the glaciers, shimmering signs of a new world. Asia too was transformed. In Siberia, immense rivers like the Ob, Lena, and Yenisei swelled with meltwater, carving even deeper channels across the vast tundra. In Central Asia, glacial melt fed inland seas and lakes, some of which grew to enormous size before shrinking again as climates shifted. Even today, traces of these ancient lakes can be found in the deserts, dry basins where once there was water, the ghost footprints of the Ice Age floodwaters. The creation of new lakes and rivers didn't only change geography, it altered ecosystems in profound ways. Where there was water, there was life. Fish spread into new basins, birds followed, forests grew along riverbanks. The spread of water reshaped migration routes for animals and humans alike. Herds of animals came to drink at new lakes, and people followed them. Fish became a vital food source, and river valleys became gathering places. The rhythm of life began to follow the rhythm of these new waters. It's important to imagine the emotional side of this transformation. For people living through it, the earth was not fixed. It was shifting, fluid, alive. A valley that had once been a hunting ground might suddenly fill with water, becoming a lake. a small stream might swell into a river too wide to cross. Landscapes remembered by grandparents were gone, replaced by something new. That sense of impermanence must have been both frightening and awe-inspiring. At the same time that the oceans drowned coastlines, inland, water gave new life, creating fertile zones where communities could thrive. It was a world of loss and renewal, destruction and creation happening side by side. Some of the world's most enduring river systems were shaped or reshaped during this period. The Nile, swollen by meltwater from African glaciers, carved its way northward with even greater force. The Tigris and Euphrates carried the weight of shifting climates, eventually feeding the Fertile Crescent where agriculture would begin. In China, the Yellow River and Yangtze expanded their courses, their floods laying down fertile soils that would one day feed early civilizations. Everywhere the glaciers retreated, water wrote new lines on the land, and those lines became the stage for human history. And it wasn't only natural landscapes that were transformed. Human culture itself began to reflect the centrality of lakes and rivers. Settlements clustered around them. Myths grew out of them. Rituals were tied to their cycles. In the stories passed down, water was often not just a resource but a living force, giver of life, bringer of floods, boundary between worlds. The memory of the flood that had reshaped the planet was echoed in smaller, daily experiences with rivers that rose and fell, lakes that appeared and vanished. For archaeologists, these lakes and rivers are keys to unlocking human pasts. Settlements preserved beneath lake beds reveal tools, bones, and even traces of early farming. Rivers carry sediments that tell us about climates long gone, pollen trapped in layers that reveal what plants grew nearby, charcoal that whispers of ancient fires. Every core sample taken from a lake bottom is like a diary, page after page written in mud and silt, chronicling the centuries of change since the ice retreated. It's also worth remembering that these new lakes and rivers were not permanent. Just as they were born from change, they continued to change. Some drained away as ice dams collapsed. Others evaporated when climates warmed further. Still others, like the Great Lakes or Lake Baikal in Siberia, endured, becoming permanent fixtures of the landscape. The story of these waters is one of constant flux, reminding us that nothing in nature is fixed, not even the rivers we think of as eternal. Imagine sitting by one of these newborn lakes 12,000 years ago. The air is still, the water smooth, broken only by the occasional ripple of a fish or the flight of a bird across its surface. You dip a hand into the cold water, fresh from glaciers, and feel its chill run through you. Around you, plants are beginning to grow in the damp soil, animals coming to drink at the shore. The world feels new, fragile, and full of possibility. That lake is not just water. It is a symbol of survival, of adaptation, of a planet remaking itself in the wake of catastrophe. And so, after the flood, Earth became a world of lakes and rivers, of waters newly born from retreating ice. They were not only features of geography but lifelines for life. They gave people places to settle, food to eat, and stories to tell. They carried with them the memory of the glaciers that had shaped them and the promise of futures yet to come. The drowned coastlines had taken, but inland the new lakes and rivers gave back, ensuring that life, though changed, would continue to flow. As the ice retreated and waters filled new basins, something else began to take root across the land. Where once there had been sheets of white stretching endlessly to the horizon, there were now patches of green, small at first, but growing with every season. Mosses and lichens were often the pioneers, clinging to bare rock left behind by glaciers. Then came grasses, shrubs, and eventually forests, expanding into spaces that had been uninhabitable for tens of thousands of years. The rebirth of forests and the spread of grasslands after the Great Flood marked not only a transformation of landscapes, but the beginning of new ecosystems that would shape life on Earth in profound ways. To imagine this shift, picture Northern Europe at the end of the Ice Age. For thousands of years, much of the region had been buried under glaciers. The weight of that ice had pressed the land down, and nothing grew on the barren white expanse. But as the ice pulled back, sunlight touched soil again. Seeds carried by wind and water, dormant for years, began to sprout. Grasses covered valleys once carved by glaciers. Birch trees spread quickly, followed by pine and then oak. Slowly, an empty wilderness became a patchwork of meadows and forests. To the humans who ventured back north after the ice receded, the land must have seemed miraculous, as if the earth itself were waking up. The same story played out across North America. Vast areas that had been tundra transformed into grasslands, then forests. Herds of animals followed, drawn by the abundance of plants. Mammoths, mastodons, bison, horses and deer roamed these new plains, while predators like saber-toothed cats and dire wolves followed close behind. Rivers and lakes created by the retreating glaciers became magnets for life, drawing animals and people alike. Where ice had once reigned, now there was a thriving web of life, buzzing, running, flying and flourishing. These changes were not uniform. Some areas became dense with trees, while others remained open grasslands. Climate, rainfall and soil shaped what grew where. In regions with enough moisture, great forests rose. In drier areas, grassland stretched wide. Together, these environments created a diversity that had not existed for tens of thousands of years. It was as if the earth, freed from its icy prison, decided to cover itself with every shade of green it could muster. The spread of forests had profound effects on climate. Trees absorbed carbon dioxide and released oxygen, helping stabilize the atmosphere after the upheavals of glacial retreat. Forests also altered rainfall patterns, drawing moisture into the air and feeding local weather systems. In turn, those rains nurtured more plant life, creating a feedback loop that encouraged growth. In a very real sense, forests reborn after the Ice Age helped set the stage for the climates we live in today. Grasslands were equally important. They may not seem as dramatic as forests, but they supported vast herds of grazing animals. Those animals in turn supported predators and scavengers, creating entire ecosystems based on open fields of grass. For humans, grasslands provided rich hunting grounds, as well as pathways for migration. Following herds across plains, people could travel great distances, carrying stories, tools and traditions with them. Grasslands were highways of both animals and ideas. Imagine being among the first humans to step into a valley once buried by ice, now covered in green. The ground is damp, rich with new soil. Birds circle overhead, nesting in young trees. Small animals dart through grasses. The silence of the glacial world has been replaced by the sounds of life. Buzzing insects, rustling leaves, the call of animals. For people who had known only the tundra and ice, this must have felt like abundance beyond imagining. Food, shelter, firewood, and beauty, all in places where none of those things had existed for generations. But forests and grasslands didn't just appear. They moved. Trees spread northward at a pace of tens of kilometers per century, a slow migration that mirrored the retreat of ice. Over thousands of years, this shift reshaped entire continents. What had been icy wastelands became woodlands. What had been deserts became savannas. And in some cases, what had been forest became grasslands again when climates shifted back toward dryness. The landscapes were never fixed. They were always in motion, responding to temperature, rainfall, and the rhythms of Earth itself. This constant change forced humans to adapt. In forests, they learned new hunting techniques, stalking deer and boar instead of mammoth. They gathered nuts, berries, and roots from the undergrowth. In grasslands, they developed strategies for hunting herds, sometimes driving animals into enclosures or traps. These new environments demanded creativity, and humans rose to the challenge. Their survival was tied to the land, and as the land changed, so did their ways of life. The spread of forests also brought new dangers. Dense woods could shelter predators, making travel more dangerous. Diseases carried by forest insects could spread among human groups. At the same time, forests offered safety and resources. They provided wood for tools, fuel for fire, and shelter from storms. For early humans, forests were both sanctuary and challenge, shaping culture and survival in equal measure. Grasslands, too, were double-edged. They offered visibility, making it easier to spot prey and predators. But they also left little cover, exposing hunters to the watchful eyes of animals and the threat of ambush. Open landscapes required different skills than forests: endurance for long hunts, cooperation among groups, and sharp observation of animal behaviour. These environments taught humans how to work together, how to plan, how to adapt not just physically but socially. The rebirth of forests and the spread of grasslands also shaped spiritual life. In myths and rituals, trees became symbols of life, growth, and connection between earth and sky. Grasslands inspired stories of vastness, freedom, and the movement of animals. For people living so close to the land, the environment was not separate from their identity. It was woven into it. The return of green after the flood was more than a physical transformation. It was a spiritual awakening, a reminder that life could return even after the world seemed buried in ice. Archaeological evidence supports these shifts. Pollen records preserved in lake sediments show the gradual replacement of tundra plants with grasses, then trees. Charcoal layers reveal that humans used fire to shape these landscapes, clearing areas for hunting or encouraging the growth of certain plants. Bones and tools found in ancient campsites show changing diets as people adapted to new environments. Together, these traces confirm what stories suggest, that the end of the Ice Age was not just a climatic event, but a complete transformation of how humans lived. Forests and grasslands also laid the foundation for agriculture. As humans gathered plants from these new environments, they began to notice which seeds grew best, which plants could be encouraged. The abundance of wild grains in grasslands and fruits in forests created opportunities for experimentation. Slowly, over thousands of years, these experiments turned into cultivation. The rebirth of green landscapes after the flood made farming possible, and farming in turn would transform human societies forever. It's striking to realise how much of our modern world still depends on these changes. The forests that grew after the Ice Age remain some of the oldest ecosystems on Earth. The grasslands that spread supported the ancestors of today's grazing animals and laid the groundwork for pastoral cultures. Even now, our fields of wheat, barley and rice trace their lineage back to those wild grasses that first spread into the empty lands left by glaciers. Imagine once more walking through one of those forests as it spread northward. The trees are young, their trunks thin, their canopy not yet dense. Light streams through, dappling the forest floor. Small animals scurry in the underbrush, while birds call from the branches. The air smells of damp earth and growing things. It is a world in transition, still raw, still new, but full of promise. And if you step out of the trees into the open, you find a sea of grass stretching toward the horizon, rippling like waves in the wind. Herds graze in the distance, and the sky above feels impossibly wide. Between forest and grassland, you're standing in the heart of a planet remade. And that was the gift of the earth after the flood. It did not simply take, it gave back in green, in abundance, in life. Forests reborn and grasslands spread, reshaping the world not just for animals and plants, but for humans who would build their future on the landscapes that emerged. And as those landscapes grew and changed, so too did the people, adapting, surviving, and carrying forward the memory of a world forever transformed. When the Ice Age loosened its hold and the waters reshaped the earth, not every creature was able to make the transition. The period after the Great Flood was not only a time of rebirth and renewal, but also a time of endings. Entire species that had once roamed in vast herds or hunted across frozen plains began to vanish. Some disappeared slowly, fading as climates shifted and their food sources dwindled. Others seemed to have vanished in sudden waves, leaving behind only bones and traces in the soil. It was an age defined by survival, where some creatures adapted and thrived in the new world, while others could not keep pace with the changes. For thousands of years, mammoths had been icons of the Ice Age. Towering, shaggy, with long, curving tusks, they had thrived in the cold expanses of tundra and grasslands. But as forests spread and the open plains shrank, their numbers dwindled. The grasses that had once supported vast herds gave way to trees and shrubs. Warmer climates brought more disease and more competition from other species. At the same time, human hunters put pressure on populations already struggling to adapt. Piece by piece, the range of mammoths contracted until they were gone from most of the world. A few small populations lingered on remote islands for thousands of years longer, but eventually even they faded, leaving behind only bones, frozen remains, and the stories humans told of the giants that once walked the earth. Mastodons, close relatives of mammoths but with different diets and habits, faced a similar fate. They had once thrived in North America's forests, browsing on trees and shrubs. But as climates shifted and forests changed, they struggled. Human hunting added more strain, and by around 10,000 years ago, mastodons had vanished. For humans who had lived alongside them, who had hunted them, their disappearance must have felt like the loss of both a food source and a part of the world's order. Imagine a child listening to an elder's story about mastodons long after they had disappeared, trying to picture creatures they would never see for themselves. And mammoths and mastodons were not alone. Giant ground sloths, some as large as elephants, roamed South America for millions of years. They dug into the earth with massive claws, feeding on leaves, moving slowly but powerfully through forests and plains. After the flood and the climate shifts that followed, they too disappeared. Saber-toothed cats with their elongated teeth, once apex predators, also vanished. Dire wolves, larger and heavier than today's wolves, followed them into extinction. Giant beavers, camels in North America, horses that had once evolved on the continent but would not return until humans reintroduced them thousands of years later. All of these creatures were part of a wave of extinctions that marked the end of the Pleistocene and the beginning of our present age. The causes of these extinctions are still debated. Climate change alone was severe enough to challenge many species. The habitats they depended on were vanishing, transformed by rising seas, spreading forests, or warming temperatures. At the same time, humans had become more skilled hunters. Equipped with stone-tipped spears, coordinated strategies, and growing populations, humans were formidable predators. It's possible that many species might have survived one of these pressures alone, but not both together. Caught between shrinking habitats and relentless hunting, many could not adapt quickly enough. For humans, the extinctions were both a loss and an opportunity. The disappearance of large animals forced people to diversify their diets. Where once mammoth hunts might have provided meat, hide, bone, and ivory, now humans turned more towards smaller animals, fish, plants, and eventually cultivation. This shift may have been one of the pressures that pushed humanity toward farming, as reliance on unstable animal populations was no longer sustainable. In this way, the extinctions that marked the end of the Ice Age also shaped the birth of agriculture and the societies that would follow. Yet not all species vanished. Many adapted and endured, becoming survivors of this great transition. Bison, for example, thrived in the new grasslands of North America. Though smaller than their Ice Age ancestors, they spread in vast herds, becoming a vital part of ecosystems and of human cultures that developed around them. Deer, elk, and moose all found niches in the reborn forests and meadows, adapting to changing diets and landscapes. Wolves, though their dire cousins disappeared, survived by remaining flexible, hunting in packs, and adapting to a wide range of prey. Bears too endured, finding food in both forests and grasslands. The survival of these species shows that flexibility was the key. Those animals able to shift their diets alter their behaviours, and move with changing environments had the best chances. Those locked into specific niches, dependent on habitats that were vanishing, were most vulnerable. In a way, the story of extinctions and survivors mirrors the broader story of life itself. Those who adapt endure, those who cannot fade into memory. Humans themselves were among the survivors, not because the world favoured them, but because they adapted relentlessly. Where mammoths could not change their diets, humans could. Where saber-toothed cats relied on specific prey, humans could shift to many. Where giant ground sloths moved slowly, humans moved quickly across continents. It was this flexibility, combined with the ability to pass knowledge through language and story, that allowed humanity to endure in a world of such rapid change. Imagine standing on a plain once filled with mammoths, now empty. The silence would have felt heavy. The absence of the giants would not have gone unnoticed. Children might ask where the great beasts had gone. Elders might point to changing skies, to warmer winds, to the stories of hunters who once chased the mammoth across snow. That silence would echo not only in daily life, but in myth, in the stories told to explain why creatures once abundant were no more. Perhaps some of the monsters in ancient tales are echoes of those lost animals, remembered in fragments long after they disappeared. Extinctions also reshaped ecosystems in lasting ways. Without mammoths and mastodons to knock down trees and graze heavily, some forests grew thicker. Without giant grazers to keep grasslands open, shrubs expanded. The very balance of ecosystems changed, altering the path of evolution for countless species that remained. Survivors were not just individuals, but entire systems of life that adjusted to new realities. For archaeologists and paleontologists, the bones of these lost animals tell stories as vivid as any myth. Frozen mammoths in Siberia still hold flesh, hair, and even stomach contents, giving us a glimpse into their diets and lives. Fossilized footprints show where herds once moved. Cave paintings left by humans depict mammoths, bison, and horses with striking detail, evidence that these creatures were not only hunted but honoured in art. Through these traces we can see both the extinctions and the survivors, both the losses and the continuities of life after the flood. The great extinctions remind us that the end of the Ice Age was not simply a smooth transition into the world we know. It was a time of upheaval, of sudden absences, of ecosystems forced into entirely new patterns. Yet even in those losses, life found ways to continue. New niches opened. Survivors thrived. Humans adapted. The world became quieter in some ways, but also more stable, setting the stage for the next chapter of history. And so, in the wake of the flood, Earth was both emptied and filled. The giants of the Ice Age vanished, leaving space for new species to emerge, while the survivors carried forward into a future they had never known before. For people, these changes were woven into memory, into myth, into survival strategies that ensured humanity itself would endure. The extinctions were real, devastating and final for some, but the survivors remind us that even in great loss, life continues, reshaping itself in forms both familiar and new. When the waters rose and the ice withdrew, it was not only the animals and the land that had to adjust. Humanity itself stood at a threshold. People who had lived in a world shaped by glaciers and cold suddenly found themselves facing a different planet, warmer, wetter, more unpredictable, and filled with landscapes they had never seen before. The deluge did not wash humans away, but it did force them to rethink everything. Where they lived, what they ate, how they moved, and even how they saw themselves were all shaped by the new conditions that emerged after the flood. It's important to picture who these people were. They were not primitive in the way we sometimes imagine. By the time the Great Flood transformed their world, humans were already skilled toolmakers, hunters, gatherers, and artists. They had painted caves with images of animals, crafted ornaments, carved figurines, and told stories that carried meaning across generations. They knew how to track game, how to shape stone into blades, how to use fire not only for warmth but for managing the land. These were people who had survived the cold grip of the Ice Age, who had adapted to scarcity, to shifting herds, to the harshness of frozen tundra. And when the waters came, they carried that same resilience into a world remade by melt and flood. The rising seas reshaped human migration. Lands that had once connected people were gone. Communities that had been neighbours across plains and rivers suddenly found themselves separated by water. In Eurasia, the flooding of Doggerland cut Britain off from the continent. In Southeast Asia, the drowning of Sunderland fragmented what had once been a continuous plain into hundreds of islands. In the Americas, coastlines advanced inland, erasing hunting grounds and settlements. Everywhere, the flood redrew the map, and humanity had to adjust. Some groups retreated inland, seeking new hunting grounds in forests and valleys. Others turned toward the water itself, learning to fish, to build boats, to navigate coasts. In that way, the deluge did not just destroy, it pushed humans to become more inventive. Food was at the centre of this shift. Large animals that had been staples of Ice Age hunting were disappearing, whether from climate changes, habitat loss, or hunting pressure. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, and other megafauna were fading from the earth. That loss forced humans to broaden their diets. Smaller game, fish, shellfish, birds and plants became increasingly important. Gathering nuts, seeds and roots provided reliable sources of food when big hunts were less predictable. In some regions, this growing reliance on plants laid the groundwork for farming. The domestication of wheat, barley, rice, and maize all trace back to this period of transition when people began experimenting with tending the plants they had long gathered. Fire became another tool for reshaping landscapes. People used it to clear forests, to encourage the growth of certain plants, and to make hunting easier. In doing so, they began to take a more active role in managing the ecosystems around them. This shift from passive survival to active shaping of the land was subtle at first, but it marked the beginnings of humanity's long path toward agriculture, settlement, and civilization. After the deluge, humans were no longer simply enduring the changes of the planet. They were beginning to change the planet in return. Social life also adapted. Rising waters and shifting ecosystems meant movement. Groups that had once lived in familiar places had to migrate, sometimes merging with others, sometimes competing for resources. These encounters brought both conflict and cooperation. New technologies spread more quickly as groups came into contact. Stone tool techniques, fishing methods, and eventually farming practices crossed boundaries as people carried knowledge with them. The flood, in this sense, was not just a physical event but a cultural one, forcing people into closer contact and accelerating the exchange of ideas. The spiritual and symbolic worlds of humans changed as well. Flood myths became a common thread in cultures across the globe, suggesting that the memory of rising waters etched itself deeply into the human mind. These stories often carried themes of destruction and renewal, of divine judgment and survival. They were not only ways of remembering the past, but also ways of making sense of change. For people who had watched lands vanish beneath waves, stories gave meaning to loss. They also offered hope, narratives where survival was possible, where humanity endured even in the face of overwhelming forces. The deluge became not only a memory of water, but a metaphor for resilience. Imagine sitting with a small community 12,000 years ago, gathered around a fire at the edge of a newly formed lake. The elders tell of lands that once lay farther out, of valleys now drowned. They speak of animals that no longer roam, of hunts that once sustained their families but can no longer be found. The children listen with wide eyes, growing up in a world where change is the only constant. They learn not only skills but stories, carrying with them both the practical tools to survive and the deeper lessons of endurance. That blending of memory and adaptation is what carried humanity forward after the flood. Technology advanced in quiet but significant ways. fishing nets, bone hooks, canoes, and rafts became increasingly important. In places where rivers and lakes spread, humans learned to use waterways as highways, moving goods and knowledge across greater distances. The bow and arrow began to spread during this period, offering more efficient hunting of smaller game. Grinding stones appeared, used to process grains and seeds into flour. Each of these innovations reflected a shift in human needs and environments, a direct response to the new challenges of a world remade by water and climate. Archaeological sites give us glimpses of these changes. In the Fertile Crescent, evidence shows communities experimenting with early forms of farming as early as 10,000 years ago, just after the Great Flood era. In Japan, the Jomon people developed some of the world's earliest pottery, likely used for cooking and storing food in a world where diets had become more plant and fish-based. In North America, sites reveal shifts from hunting large game to exploiting smaller, more diverse food sources. Everywhere, the pattern is the same. After the deluge, humans adjusted, inventing, experimenting and surviving. And it wasn't only survival, it was the beginnings of flourishing. The stability that followed the Great Flood gave humans the opportunity to settle more permanently. Instead of chasing herds across vast plains, they could plant crops, build villages, and develop traditions rooted in place. This was not immediate or universal. Many groups continued to live as hunters and gatherers for thousands of years, but the seeds of a new way of life were planted. Those seeds would grow into farming, cities and civilizations, all because humanity found ways to endure after the flood. But even as people settled, the memory of the deluge never left. Stories of rising waters were carried in myths, rituals often centered on water, on rivers, on fertility and renewal. In many cultures, the line between land and sea was seen as a boundary between worlds, reflecting the real experience of coastlines advancing inland and swallowing the familiar. These cultural echoes show how deeply the flood shaped not just survival, but imagination. Survivors of the deluge were also faced with choices. Some embraced the new, becoming farmers and fishers. Others clung to older ways, following herds into shrinking grasslands. The coexistence of these paths shows that humanity was not moving along a single line of progress, but exploring many ways of living. In the long run, those who farmed had an advantage, producing more food and supporting larger populations. But for thousands of years after the flood, diversity of lifestyles remained, each adapted to specific environments. The flood also made humans more mobile. Rising seas forced migrations, sometimes over great distances. People followed rivers into new lands, sailed to islands that had once been part of larger continents, and spread into territories that had previously been locked in ice. This mobility accelerated the global spread of humanity, ensuring that people reached nearly every corner of the planet. After the flood, humanity was no longer only surviving in pockets, it was expanding, exploring, and filling the world. And through it all, there was continuity. Families raised children, communities told stories, people made art. Caves continued to be painted, beads continued to be strung, and music continued to be played on flutes carved from bone. Even in the midst of upheaval, humans held on to the need for beauty, meaning, and connection. The flood may have reshaped the physical world, but did not wash away the essence of what it meant to be human. In the end, humanity after the deluge was both fragile and strong. Fragile in the face of forces beyond control, rising seas, vanishing animals, shifting climates. Strong in the ability to adapt, to create, to endure. Out of that balance came everything that followed. Farming, villages, civilizations, and eventually the world we live in today. The flood was not the end. For humans, it was the beginning of something entirely new. When waters rise and lands vanish, the earth itself seems to erase memory. Villages are swallowed, trails disappear, burial grounds are lost. Yet humans have always had ways of resisting that kind of forgetting. We carry what we cannot hold in story. We turn what we witness into myth, preserving experience not in stone or parchment, but in tales repeated by voice, by song, by ritual. The great flood that reshaped the world after the Ice Age was remembered this way. Across continents and across time, people spoke of waters that drowned their world, of gods or spirits who warned them, of survivors who carried life into a new age. These myths are not identical, but they share a rhythm, a pulse, as if they all echo the same truth. One of the most famous stories comes from Mesopotamia. Long before the tale of Noah entered the Hebrew Bible, the Epic of Gilgamesh told of Utnapishtim, a man warned by the gods of a coming deluge. He built a massive vessel, filled it with animals and his family, and survived while the flood swept over the world. When the waters receded, his boat rested on a mountain, and life began again. This story was inscribed in clay thousands of years ago, but it almost certainly reaches back further, perhaps to the memory of when the rivers of the Fertile Crescent swelled with meltwater, or when the Persian Gulf swallowed its valleys. In India, there is the story of Manu, who was warned by a fish, an avatar of Vishnu, that a great flood would come. The fish instructed him to build a boat and bring seeds of every plant along with animals to preserve life. When the waters rose, the fish towed Manu's boat to safety, and from him, humanity began again. This tale, like others, is not just about destruction, but about preservation, about survival through divine guidance. Its imagery, seeds carried into the future, a vessel pulled through the waters, speaks of a people who knew the fragility of life when seas consumed land. Among the Greeks, there is the myth of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Warned by Zeus of an impending flood meant to cleanse humanity, they built a chest and survived as the waters rose. When the flood receded, they repopulated the earth by casting stones behind them, which transformed into people. The tale carries with it the same themes: judgment, destruction, survival, renewal, that echo through flood myths across the world. It is a pattern almost too consistent to be coincidence. Far across the ocean, in the Americas, indigenous peoples carried their own flood stories. The Hopi tell of a world destroyed by water when people strayed too far from harmony. Survivors were guided to safety by spiritual beings, emerging into a new world after the waters receded. The Ojibwe speak of a flood that covered the earth, where animals helped recreate land by diving beneath the waters to bring back mud. In Mesoamerica, Mayan traditions describe earlier worlds destroyed by flood before the present one was formed. Again and again, the themes align. Water overwhelms, the world is cleansed, survivors endure. In the Pacific Islands, flood myths take on forms suited to life surrounded by ocean. Stories from Polynesia tell of islands sinking, of gods lifting survivors to higher ground, of canoes carrying people across endless seas after their homes were submerged. These tales may reflect memories of rising waters that transformed coastlines across the Pacific, scattering islands and shrinking once larger lands. The stories preserve not only the disaster, but also the knowledge of navigation, survival, and renewal. Even in Northern Europe, among Norse traditions, there are echoes of water overwhelming the world. In the great cycles of myth, floods and seas often mark the boundaries between ages, washing away what came before so that something new can emerge. The pattern holds: destruction, survival, renewal. It is tempting to see these myths only as stories, shaped by imagination, by the need for meaning. But when they appear across so many cultures, in places separated by oceans, with details so strikingly similar, they suggest something more. They suggest memory. Not memory in the way we think of recalling yesterday, but cultural memory. The kind that survives not in a single mind, but in the telling and retelling across generations. Oral traditions can last far longer than we often assume. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples have stories of coastlines that are now underwater. describing bays and landmarks that geologists confirm existed before seas rose. Those stories are at least 7,000 years old, perhaps older, passed down with such care that even the geography remains intact. If those memories can endure, then it's not difficult to believe that flood myths worldwide carry echoes of the great inundations 12,000 years ago. The language of myth transforms natural events into moral or spiritual lessons. A flood is not simply water rising, it becomes a judgment, a cleansing, a renewal. Survivors are not just lucky, they are chosen, or wise enough to listen to warnings, or blessed by divine beings. This framing gives meaning to what might otherwise feel senseless. Why did the waters rise? Why was land lost? Why did animals vanish? Through myth, the answers come because the gods demanded it, because humanity needed cleansing, because the world needed renewal. These answers may not satisfy modern science, but they carried comfort and coherence to those who lived through disorienting change. And yet, the alignment between myth and science is striking. We know now that sea levels rose more than 100 metres at the end of the Ice Age, drowning coastlines across the globe. We know that great floods swept through river valleys as glacial lakes burst. We know that entire ecosystems vanished, forcing humans to migrate and adapt. These are facts written in sediments, in fossils, in ice cores. When myths from Mesopotamia, India, the Americas, and the Pacific all speak of waters covering the earth, it is hard not to see them as parallel accounts of the same reality. Science uncovers the mechanics, myth preserves the human experience. Together they tell a fuller story. Imagine being one of those survivors, watching as the shoreline moved closer year after year. Your grandparents tell you stories of fields where they once gathered food, now drowned. Your parents tell you of homes abandoned as rivers rose. You see the waters creeping higher, swallowing landmarks, forcing your community to move. One night, around the fire, you hear the tale of how the gods sent water to test humanity, and how your people were chosen to endure. That story doesn't just explain the past, it prepares you for the future. It teaches resilience, caution, humility. It carries not only memory but wisdom. Flood myths also highlight the importance of listening. In many versions, someone is warned. A prophet, a king, a humble farmer. Those who listen to the warning survive. Those who ignore it perish. This theme reflects the reality of survival in times of change. Those who paid attention to shifting rivers, to rising tides, to the signs of nature were more likely to endure. Those who dismissed them suffered. The myths turned that hard lesson into narrative, ensuring it would be remembered by future generations. There is also something deeply human in the way these myths preserve not only destruction, but renewal. The flood ends, the waters recede, life begins again. Survivors plant seeds, release animals, build homes. The world is washed clean, and a new age begins. This theme reflects the resilience of humanity itself. Even in the face of overwhelming loss, people found ways to begin again. The myths captured that spirit, offering hope as well as warning. For us today, these myths are windows into how our ancestors understood their world. They show us that memory is not only preserved in artifacts, bones and ruins, but in stories told across time. They remind us that human beings have always sought meaning in change, always woven survival into narrative, and they connect us to those who lived 12,000 years ago, showing that we are not so different. We too seek to explain the forces that reshape our world. We too tell stories of catastrophe and survival, of endings and beginnings. The flood myths, in the end, are not fantasies. They are echoes of truth, shaped by memory, transformed by imagination, carried across centuries. They are reminders that Earth itself changes, that waters rise, that nothing is permanent. But they are also reminders that we endure, that we adapt, that even when the world seems to drown, life finds a way forward. When the ice melted and the seas rose, it seemed as though the Earth was finally moving into a new, warmer age. Forests were spreading, rivers were flowing, animals were returning, and humans were finding ways to adapt. Yet the planet is rarely so predictable. Just as warmth was taking hold, a sudden shift reversed the trend. The world plunged back into a period of intense cold, a final gasp of the Ice Age that scientists call the Younger Dryas. For over 1,000 years, glaciers advanced again, temperatures dropped sharply, and the promise of a warmer, greener Earth was put on hold. It was a chilling reminder that climate does not always move in smooth lines, but in jolts, in stumbles, in moments when the world seems to hesitate before moving forward. To understand the Younger Dryas, imagine living in Europe or North America around 12,800 years ago. The glaciers had been retreating, rivers had swelled with meltwater, and plants and animals were beginning to thrive again. Then, within the span of a human lifetime, the climate shifted. Winters grew harsher, summers became shorter and colder, forests stopped spreading and in some places retreated. Tundra plants once again dominated landscapes that had seemed on the verge of blooming. Herds that had returned now dwindled, and people who had been experimenting with new ways of life faced the familiar challenge of scarcity. For generations raised with the expectation of warming, the sudden cold must have been bewildering, even terrifying. Scientists still debate the cause of this sudden chill. One leading theory points to the massive influx of fresh water into the North Atlantic, released when glacial lakes such as Lake Agassiz suddenly drained. That surge of fresh water may have disrupted ocean circulation, weakening the currents that carried warm water northward. Without those currents, the North Atlantic region cooled dramatically, pulling much of the northern hemisphere into a 1,000-year winter. Another theory suggests that a comet or asteroid impact could have triggered widespread fires, releasing particles into the atmosphere and blocking sunlight. Still others propose volcanic activity as a factor. Whatever the cause, the effect was profound. The Earth stumbled back into cold just as it was emerging from ice. The Younger Dryas had global consequences. In Europe, temperatures dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in a matter of decades. Glaciers advanced once more, grinding across mountains and valleys. In the Middle East, droughts became severe, reshaping the availability of plants and animals. In North America, ice sheets stabilized for a time, halting their retreat. The sudden shift in climate created enormous challenges for every living thing on the planet. Ecosystems that had been in flux now faced a new kind of instability. Plants and animals that had just begun to spread found themselves struggling again. Humans, caught in the middle, had to adapt once more to a world they thought they had left behind. For people in the Fertile Crescent, the Younger Dryas may have been a turning point. Communities that had been gathering wild grains and experimenting with cultivation suddenly faced harsher, drier conditions. Wild food sources became less reliable, and so farming became not just an experiment but a necessity. The first permanent villages and the earlier steps toward agriculture may have been born out of the pressure of the Younger Dryas. In this way, the cold may have forced humanity onto a path that would eventually lead to civilization. What seemed at the time like a catastrophe may have been one of the sparks that lit the fire of farming. Elsewhere, humans had to rely on old skills. Hunters returned to focusing on the animals that could still survive in colder climates, such as reindeer, bison, and smaller game. Fishing became more important in some regions, as rivers and lakes remained rich with life even when fields and forests struggled. Fire once again became a crucial ally, providing warmth in harsher winters and protection against longer nights. Communities became more mobile again, chasing resources across landscapes that had grown unpredictable. The psychological toll must have been immense. Imagine growing up hearing from your parents that the world was getting warmer, that forests were returning, that animals were coming back. Then, as you grow older, you see the opposite. The world grows colder, harsher. Land you thought would bloom again becomes barren. The sense of uncertainty, of not knowing what the earth would do next, must have weighed heavily. In myths and stories, perhaps this uncertainty was explained as the will of the gods, or as punishment, or as a test. However it was framed, the Younger Dryas would have been remembered as a time of hardship, when hopes for renewal were deferred. The archaeological record reflects these struggles. Sites in the Levant show a shift toward more intensive use of plants, evidence of people trying to cope with dwindling wild resources. In Europe, stone tools from the period show continuity with earlier hunting traditions, suggesting that communities doubled down on older methods to survive. In North America, the Clovis culture, once famous for its distinctive spear points, faded during this period, giving way to new traditions better suited to changing conditions. Everywhere, the pattern is the same. Humans did not give up. They adjusted even when the climate turned against them. What makes the Younger Dryas so striking is its abruptness. Climate often shifts over thousands of years, slowly enough that generations can adapt without noticing. But the Younger Dryas arrived within decades, perhaps even years. For people alive at the time, the change would have been visible, tangible. Rivers froze longer, snow lingered deeper, plants failed to sprout as expected. This was not a distant story. It was the air they breathed, the food they hunted, the seasons they lived through. That immediacy must have been frightening, but it also meant that the memory of it lingered, perhaps echoing down through generations as stories of sudden cold and hardship. Eventually, the Younger Dryas ended just as suddenly as it had begun. Around 1600 years ago, temperatures rose sharply again, marking the true end of the Ice Age. Within decades, glaciers retreated, forests spread once more, and the Holocene epoch, the age we still live in, began. For humans, this final shift was the one that stuck. The climate stabilised, seas continued to rise but at a slower pace, and the patterns of seasons became more predictable. Out of this stability came agriculture, settlements and civilizations, but the memory of the Younger Dryas remained, a reminder that even when the earth seems to be warming, cold can return without warning. The Younger Dryas teaches us something important about resilience. It shows that humans are not only capable of adapting to slow change, but also to sudden shocks. It shows that survival depends on flexibility, on creativity, on the willingness to shift strategies when old ones no longer work. And it shows that even the harshest setbacks can sometimes lead to unexpected new paths. In this case, the birth of farming and the rise of settled life. Imagine again a community at the edge of the Fertile Crescent, struggling with drought during the Younger Dryas. The fields are dry, wild grains scarce. A group of families begins planting seeds more deliberately, tending them, protecting them from animals, watering them when rain fails. Slowly those seeds become crops. Those crops become harvests. And those harvests allow villages to grow, to stay in place, to build traditions rooted in soil rather than in constant movement. From the cold and the hardship, something entirely new takes shape. The Younger Dryas was not just an age of loss, it was an age of transformation. And so the story of the Younger Dryas flows into the larger story of the Earth after the flood. It was a pause, a shiver, a sudden chill that tested both ecosystems and people. But it was also the final step before the world we know began. The ice receded once and for all, the seas rose to near their present levels, and humanity entered a new age. The chill was temporary, but its effects were lasting, shaping the path of humans, animals and landscapes alike. When the cold of the Younger Dryas finally released its grip, the Earth settled into a more stable climate. Temperatures rose again, rainfall became more predictable, and the chaos of sudden freezes gave way to gentler seasons. This new stability created opportunities, and humans were quick to recognize them. The Great Flood had reshaped landscapes, carved new rivers, and filled valleys with fertile soils. Now, as the world warmed, those soils were ready to grow. It was in this moment that humans began to do something extraordinary. They stopped depending entirely on the uncertainty of hunting and gathering and started shaping the land itself. The first seeds were deliberately planted, the first fields tended, and the long journey of farming began. It's difficult to imagine the leap this represented. For countless generations, people had lived by following animals and gathering plants wherever they appeared. Their knowledge of plants was deep. They knew which roots to dig, which seeds to grind, which berries to avoid, but they had never relied on themselves to make those plants grow in predictable places. Then came the experiments. Perhaps it started with a patch of wild grain near a camp. People noticed that dropped seeds sprouted the following year, creating new stalks. Perhaps they cleared an area with fire, returned months later, and found edible plants flourishing in the ashes. Slowly the idea formed. What if, instead of only gathering what nature provided, humans could help create abundance by guiding it? In the Fertile Crescent, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved rich valleys, this idea became reality. Wild wheat, barley and lentils grew along riverbanks. People began scattering seeds intentionally, returning to tend them, learning how to weed, water, and protect them. With every season, knowledge deepened. The process was not instant. It took centuries of trial and error, but little by little, humans transformed from foragers into farmers. By around 11,000 years ago, the first true villages had formed, with families returning to the same place year after year, no longer entirely dependent on the chase. Farming was not only about plants. Animals, too, became part of the experiment. Dogs had already been companions for thousands of years, helping with hunting and protection. Now, sheep and goats began to be tamed. They provided milk, meat, hides, and wool. Over time, these animals were bred to be more docile, more productive, more suited to human needs. The partnership between humans and animals deepened, becoming a cornerstone of survival. Later came cattle and pigs, each offering food and labour. Together, the domestication of plants and animals marked one of the greatest transformations in human history. The first farmers did not think of themselves as inventing something new. They were simply solving problems, finding ways to survive in a world that had become unpredictable. Hunting alone was no longer enough, especially after so many large animals had disappeared. Gathering alone could not always provide the stability communities needed. Farming filled the gap. It offered food that could be stored, seeds that could be planted again, animals that could be tended and relied upon. For the first time, humans had a measure of control over their food supply. That control changed everything. Villages grew because food could support larger groups. Storage pits were dug to keep grain safe. Clay pots were shaped to hold surplus harvests. Walls were built to protect fields and animals. Slowly, the rhythm of life shifted from the movements of herds to the cycles of planting and harvest. The year itself became something new, a calendar of seasons, marked not only by solstices and equinoxes, but by when to sow and when to reap. Time, which had once been measured by migrations and weather, now became rooted in the soil. The psychological impact of this change must have been immense. For people who had always lived in uncertainty, never knowing if the next hunt would succeed or if wild plants would appear, farming provided a sense of stability. It gave them something to count on, something to build around. At the same time, it demanded patience and planning. A farmer had to think months ahead, imagining the future harvest while planting seeds in the present. That way of thinking, of planning for the future, became embedded in human culture. Of course, farming was not without risks. Crops could fail, herds could be struck by disease. A bad season could still mean hunger. Yet even with these dangers, the benefits outweighed the risks. Farming spread quickly, not only in the Fertile Crescent but also in other parts of the world. In China, millet and rice were cultivated. In the Americas, maize, beans and squash took root. In Africa, Sorghum and yams became staples. Each region found its own path to farming, guided by the plants and animals native to its land. What all shared was the same realization. Humans could shape the earth to provide. The first farmers left behind traces that still speak to us today. Tools of polished stone used for grinding grain, storage jars decorated with simple designs, remains of early houses built with mud brick. These remnants show not only the practical side of farming, but also the beginnings of community. Farming tied people to places, and places became homes. With homes came the chance to invest in traditions, in rituals, in shared stories rooted in the land. It's not hard to imagine what a farming village 12,000 years ago might have looked like. Small clusters of homes made of clay or wood, fields stretching nearby, goats or sheep tethered close, children helping gather seeds, women grinding grain into flour, men repairing tools or tending flocks. At night, fires burned in hearths while stories were told of ancestors, of floods, of gods who gave or withheld the bounty of the earth. The rhythm of life was different, but at its heart it carried the same essence: survival, community, meaning. The shift to farming also began to alter human relationships with the natural world. No longer just participants in ecosystems, humans became managers, even masters of certain landscapes. They cleared forests to make fields, they redirected rivers for irrigation, they bred plants and animals to suit their needs. This was the beginning of a new kind of power, one that would eventually reshape the planet on a scale even greater than the floods and glaciers. At the time, though, it was simply survival, an effort to carve stability out of uncertainty. The social structures of these early farming communities began to change as well. With more food available, populations grew. Larger groups meant more complex organisation. Leaders emerged to manage planting and harvest. Rituals grew around the cycles of growth and death, around the fertility of the soil, around the animals that sustained them. The seeds of religion, politics and culture were all planted alongside the first wheat and barley. Farming was not only a practical shift, but a cultural revolution. And yet, not everyone embraced it. Many groups continued to live as hunters and gatherers, even while farming spread. In some regions, these lifestyles coexisted for thousands of years, with farmers trading food for furs, meat, or other resources gathered by mobile groups. In other places, tension arose, as settled farmers defended their fields from nomadic hunters. The balance between these ways of life was never simple, but it shows that humanity after the flood was not moving in a single direction. It was exploring many paths, all shaped by the same changes in climate and landscape. For archaeologists, the transition to farming is one of the most fascinating puzzles. It did not happen overnight, nor in one place alone. It was a gradual, scattered process, unfolding across continents in different ways. But the timing, emerging just after the flood and the Younger Dryas, suggests that global climate played a decisive role. When the Earth stabilised, when the rains returned, when the world warmed, humans seized the chance to cultivate. Without that moment, the story of civilization might have been very different. The first farmers were not only shaping their own lives, but laying the foundation for everything that would follow. Villages became towns, towns became cities, cities became civilizations. Writing, trade, art and government all depended on the stability provided by farming. Every library, every temple, every road we know today can trace its lineage back to those first fields sown after the flood. And so, as the world healed from ice and water, as forests spread and animals adapted, humans too found a new way to live. They planted seeds, they raised flocks, they built villages. The flood had taken much, but in its wake, it gave an opportunity for growth unlike any before. The first farmers took root, and with them, humanity began to grow into something new, something enduring, something that would carry us from the uncertainty of the Ice Age into the beginnings of history itself. As the water settled and the climate warmed after the Younger Dryas, the earth began to look different again. It was not just the forests spreading or the rivers carving new paths, it was the return of animals, reshaping landscapes alongside the plants and people. Life that had been pushed southward during the cold years slowly moved back north, reclaiming ground that had been buried in ice. Where mammoths, saber-toothed cats and giant ground sloths had disappeared, new species emerged or old ones expanded to fill the empty roles left behind. The world that took shape in these years was not the same as before. It was a world of survivors, of opportunists, of creatures willing to adapt. And as they returned, the land itself began to change with them. Imagine the northern plains of Europe or North America just after the ice had melted away. The land is scarred and raw, dotted with young forests and wide stretches of grass. Into this space come herds of deer, elk and bison, spreading quickly across the open ground. Wolves follow, moving with the herds, hunting, keeping populations balanced. Beavers appear along rivers, cutting down saplings, building dams that create ponds and wetlands. Birds return in flocks, nesting in new forests, filling the skies with movement and sound. The silence of the glacial world is replaced by the noise of life returning in waves. The disappearance of the megafauna had left open niches and smaller animals adapted to fill them. Where giant herbivores once grazed, deer and bison thrived. Where saber-toothed cats once hunted, wolves and smaller cats spread. Rabbits and hares multiplied in the grasslands, feeding foxes, hawks and eagles. Even insects expanded into new ranges, pollinating the flowers that spread as forests thickened. Each returning species played a part in reshaping the land, not only by living in it, but by actively altering it. Animals are engineers of the earth as much as ice or water, and their return helped sculpt the new landscapes. Take beavers, for example. With their dams and lodges, they created wetlands that became havens for fish, frogs and birds. These wetlands filtered water, enriched soil, and spread biodiversity. Without beavers, rivers would have cut straight through valleys, but with them the land became richer, more varied, more alive. Or consider grazing animals. Herds of bison or deer kept grasslands open, preventing trees from reclaiming every space. Their grazing maintained balance between forest and meadow, shaping where different plants could thrive. Predators, in turn, ensured that these herds did not grow too large, maintaining a rhythm that kept ecosystems stable. The return of animals was not passive, it was an act of renewal, a rebuilding of balance. For humans, this resurgence was both a gift and a challenge. New sources of food meant new opportunities for hunting and gathering. Deer and elk provided meat, hides, and bone. Fish filled rivers that had never existed before. Birds and their eggs offered nourishment. But with the return of animals came predators too. Wolves, bears, and large cats that competed with humans for the same prey, or threatened their settlements. Living among these animals demanded respect, caution, and adaptability. The relationship between people and animals during this period was complex. Some were hunted, some avoided, some eventually domesticated. Dogs, already companions, helped in hunting these returning herds, giving humans an advantage. Goats and sheep, once wild in rocky hills, began to be tamed, providing steady resources. Cattle descended from aurochs, powerful animals that roamed across Europe and Asia, would later be brought under human control as well. The return of animals was not only a natural process, it was the beginning of partnerships that would shape human survival for millennia. But the animals did more than provide food or companionship. They influenced how people saw the world. In myths and rituals, animals often appeared as messengers, as guardians, as sacred beings. The return of deer to forests or the movement of fish upriver became symbols woven into stories. In art, animals were carved into bone, painted on pottery, etched into stone. Their presence was not only physical but spiritual, remind us that humans lived within a larger web of life. The landscapes themselves were changing alongside these animals. Where glaciers had scoured the land, soil was thin and raw. But as plants grew and animals spread, nutrients returned to the earth. Forests matured, grasslands stabilized, wetlands expanded. Rivers carried sediments that built fertile floodplains. Over centuries, what had been barren wasteland became some of the richest environments on the planet. The Amazon basin, fueled by meltwater and spreading rains, exploded in diversity. The plains of North America became seas of grass filled with grazing herds. Europe's forests thickened, home to boar, wolves, and countless birds. Each continent, shaped by the combination of water, plants, and animals, took on the form we still recognize today. The return of animals also created new pathways for human movement. Hunters followed herds across open plains. Fishers settled along rivers. Gatherers moved with the seasons of migration. These patterns tied human life more deeply to animal rhythms. People began to anticipate when fish would return upstream, when birds would migrate, when herds would pass by. This knowledge became part of survival, part of culture, passed down from generation to generation. Archaeological evidence tells us much about this relationship. Sites filled with animal bones reveal what people hunted, what they ate, and how they used every part of the creatures they killed. Carvings and cave art show animals with reverence, sometimes blending human and animal forms, perhaps to express a spiritual bond. Footprints preserved in mud and stone show humans walking alongside animals, not always in pursuit, but sometimes simply sharing the same space. These traces remind us that humans were not outside of these landscapes. They were part of them, as dependent on animals as animals were on the plants and waters that sustained them. It's worth imagining how different the world must have felt at this time. To stand on the bank of a young river, hearing frogs calling, fish splashing, birds nesting in branches overhead. To walk through a meadow where deer grazed, while wolves watched from the edge of the trees. To hear the lowing of aurochs echoing across a valley, their massive horns a sight of both fear and awe. To see the balance of life not as something separate but as something immediate, surrounding you every moment. The return of animals made the world feel alive again in a way it had not during the long silence of the Ice Age. And yet this return was fragile. The memory of extinctions was still fresh. People knew that animals could vanish, that abundance was not guaranteed. That awareness may have shaped how humans treated animals, sometimes with respect, sometimes with exploitation, often with a mixture of both. It also may have reinforced the importance of rituals, of offerings, of myths that placed animals at the centre of the human world. The landscapes that formed during this period remain with us today. Many of the rivers, forests and plains we know are direct descendants of those reshaped after the flood. Many of the animals that spread then are still our companions, whether as wild herds, domesticated flocks, or symbolic presences in culture. The patterns established then, migration routes, grazing cycles, predator-prey relationships, set the foundation for ecosystems that continue to function thousands of years later. And through it all, humans walked alongside, adapting, observing, shaping, and being shaped in return. The flood had reset the world, wiping away old landscapes and species, but it also gave space for new life to flourish, for animals to return, for landscapes to form in ways both familiar and new. The earth that emerged was vibrant, diverse, and alive, a world of survivors and of renewal. When seas rose after the Ice Age, they did not only swallow forests and hunting grounds, they also took with them entire communities. People had lived along coasts and river valleys for tens of thousands of years, building shelters, gathering food, leaving traces of themselves on the land. But as waters advanced, many of those places disappeared beneath the waves. What remains are whispers, sunken ruins, scattered artifacts, and stories carried through myth. These are the traces of civilizations by the shore, now hidden underwater, remind us that the earliest chapters of human history are often buried beyond our sight. One of the most famous examples lies beneath the North Sea. What archaeologists call Doggerland was once a vast plain that connected Britain to mainland Europe. It was not empty land, but home to rivers, forests, and communities of hunters and gatherers. Families fished in lakes, stalked deer in meadows, and built camps where the seasons allowed. For thousands of years, Doggerland thrived. Then, as seas rose, the land shrank. Marshes spread, rivers widened, lakes overflowed. Finally, the sea claimed it all. Today, fishermen sometimes pull bones, tools, and even remnants of structures from the seabed. Proof that beneath the waves lies a world that was once alive with human presence. Doggerland is not just a lost land. It is a lost way of life, preserved in fragments but drowned in silence. Farther east, in the Indian Ocean, lies another mystery. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Kambat, sonar scans have revealed structures that resemble walls, steps, and geometric patterns stretching along the seabed. Debate continues among scientists about whether these are natural formations or the remains of ancient settlements, but the possibility remains tantalizing. If they are truly man-made, they would be among the oldest known urban sites in the world, drowned when seas rose thousands of years ago. Even if the exact truth is uncertain, the presence of artifacts, pottery shards, stone tools, suggests that people lived there, close to rivers that are now beneath the sea. In Japan, divers have explored submerged structures off Yonaguni, shaped in ways that seem deliberate, like terraces, steps, and pillars. Some argue they are entirely natural, carved by geological forces, while others see evidence of human hands. Whether natural or not, the fascination comes from the idea that early settlements, perhaps even temples, could lie beneath the sea, forgotten until modern divers stumbled upon them. The debate itself reflects how easily human history can be hidden by water, leaving us with questions that may never be fully answered. In the Mediterranean, ruins of ancient harbours and towns lie beneath the waves, some dating back thousands of years. While many are younger than the Great Flood era, their presence reminds us that coasts have always been vulnerable. Cities like Alexandria in Egypt have sections now underwater, their stones toppled by earthquakes and rising seas. Even older traces may still lie deeper, waiting to be discovered in places where the shoreline once stretched far beyond today's limits. In Southeast Asia, the story is even larger. What is now an archipelago of thousands of islands, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, was once a single connected landmass, known as Sundaland. People lived across its plains, hunting, gathering, and building communities. As seas rose, the land broke apart, leaving behind the scattered islands we see today. Imagine the scale of that transformation. Entire valleys drowned, mountains turned into islands, rivers lost beneath the ocean. The people of Sunderland carried their stories inland, perhaps into myths of floods and gods, while the land they once knew vanished forever. These drowned places were not necessarily civilizations in the way we think of pyramids, palaces, and writing. Many were small communities, bands of families living by fishing, hunting, and gathering. But for them, those places were home, rich with meaning, with memory, with identity. The loss of those lands was not just physical, it was cultural. Burial sites disappeared, sacred places were submerged, and with them parts of the human story were erased. What we call lost civilizations are not only about buildings or artifacts, but about lives lived in spaces now gone. The possibility of older, more advanced civilizations by the shore also lingers in imagination. Some suggest that rising seas may have drowned early centres of culture that we have yet to uncover. The legend of Atlantis, recorded by Plato, describes a great island civilization that sank beneath the sea. Whether rooted in truth or entirely symbolic, the story resonates because it echoes a reality the ancient world knew. Seas do rise, and entire worlds can vanish beneath them. Atlantis may not exist as Plato described, but countless smaller Atlantises did. Doggerland, Sunderland, the Gulf of Kambat, Yonaguni, and many more still waiting to be revealed. Modern science helps uncover these places bit by bit. Sonar mapping reveals drowned valleys and riverbeds on continental shelves. Archaeologists dive into shallow waters, recovering tools, bones and pottery. Each discovery adds to a picture of a world far older than our written records suggest. A world where people lived close to the shore, only to see their homes swallowed by the tide. The fact that so many myths from so many cultures speak of floods is not surprising, because so many people lived through them and so many places were lost. It is worth imagining what it would feel like to see your world vanish in this way, to wake one morning and find the shoreline closer than it had ever been, to watch the sea claim the fields where your grandparents gathered food, to know that the graves of your ancestors now lay beneath waves you could never cross, to move inland, carrying memories, telling children of lands they would never see. That is the human side of these lost civilizations, not the ruins, not the stones, but the memories of loss, carried in story. Even now these places call to us. Dievas exploring Yonaguni speak of the eerie silence of its steps. Archaeologists working in the North Sea imagined forests where now only fish swim. The fascination is not only scientific, but deeply human. We long to know what came before, to touch the lives of those who stood on coasts now drowned. The lost civilizations by the shore are not only about the past, they remind us of the fragility of the present, of how easily the sea can reclaim what we think is permanent. And so, beneath the waves, hidden in mud and stone, lie pieces of our story. Some will be discovered, some may never be found. But whether we see them or not, they remind us that humanity has always lived at the edge of change, at the boundary between land and sea. The flood 12,000 years ago was not just a natural event. It was a turning point that reshaped where we live, how we remember, and what we forget. The civilizations by the shore may be lost to the eye, but they remain alive in memory, in myth, and in the curiosity that drives us to keep searching. When people looked up after the floods and the return of warmth, the sky was not the same as the one their ancestors had known. Stars had shifted, constellations appeared in slightly different places, and the rhythms of the heavens moved with the rhythms of the earth. As the glaciers melted and the weight of ice lifted, the planet itself flexed and adjusted. Land rose, seas spread, and even the axis of the earth shifted ever so slightly. These changes affected the way the sky appeared from the ground. To us the stars feel eternal, always the same each night, but to people living 12,000 years ago, the heavens were another reminder that nothing was permanent. The tilt of the earth, the slow wobble of its axis, and the slight changes in orbit, phenomena scientists now call precession, obliquity and eccentricity, meant that the stars never stood still. Over thousands of years, constellations drifted across the sky. What had once risen at the spring equinox no longer did. What had once marked the height of summer shifted slowly out of alignment. These movements were slow, barely noticeable in a single lifetime, but over generations they became clear. Elders remembered that certain stars once rose over particular mountains, while younger people saw them rise in slightly different places. In this way, the heavens themselves seemed to move, to change, to mark the passing of ages. For people who depended on the stars for navigation, timing and ritual, these shifts mattered. Hunters and gatherers had long used the heavens to track seasons. Knowing when certain stars appeared meant knowing when herds would move or plants would ripen. Fishermen timed their journeys by the moon, and stars reflected on the water. With each subtle shift, calendars had to be adjusted, stories updated, rituals realigned. The sky was a living map, and as it changed, so did the guidance it offered. Imagine standing on a clear night in what is now the Middle East, looking at a sky filled with unfamiliar brightness. The Milky Way arches overhead, a river of light. Constellations are there, but not exactly as your grandparents described them. The stars have shifted slightly but undeniably. The stories told around fires must change too. Where once a hunter in the sky chased a stag in a particular place, now the chase moves across a different backdrop. The heavens became not just markers of time but storytellers, changing the tales as much as the land did. The moon, too, would have seemed different in subtle ways. Its cycles remained steady, but as coastlines advanced, the tides changed. Communities who lived along rivers and seas would have noticed shifts in the strength and timing of tides, tied directly to the moon's pull. The connection between sky and sea was intimate and immediate, reminding people that what happened above shaped what happened below. Rituals tied to the moon, harvests, hunts, festivals, carried with them a deep recognition of this connection. The return of warmth also brought clearer skies in some regions. Where glaciers had once created constant storms and overcast conditions, now there were nights of uninterrupted starlight. People could look up and see the full spread of the cosmos, brighter than most of us ever see it today. Without cities, without artificial light, the stars were overwhelming in number, stretching horizon to horizon in brilliance. That view must have shaped imagination as powerfully as any flood or forest. The heavens were not a distant backdrop, but a living presence, vast and moving, marking the rhythm of human life. Many cultures preserved this awareness in their earliest traditions. Stories of star beings, celestial hunters, and cosmic floods appear across the world. Some indigenous groups in Australia have tales describing the movement of stars that match with what astronomers know about precession. Ancient people were careful observers. They knew when something in the heavens had changed, and they carried that knowledge in myth, in song, in ritual. The flood may have reshaped the earth, but the shifting sky reminded people that even above, nothing stayed the same forever. The constellations themselves were cultural creations, patterns imposed on scattered lights. After the flood, when new generations looked up, they may have drawn new patterns, creating new constellations that reflected their changed world. A star that once rose above a river valley now rose above a sea, and so the story of that star became different. The sky was a canvas, and as the earth shifted, the stories written on that canvas shifted too. The stars also offered reassurance. Even when lands vanished, animals disappeared, and climates shifted, the sky remained consistent enough to be a guide. North was still marked by a pole star, though it shifted slowly over millennia. The cycles of the moon remained steady, month after month. The sun still rose and set, still marked the seasons with its arc. In this way, the heavens' balance changed with constancy, giving people something to hold on to when the ground itself felt uncertain. Astronomers today can trace these changes with precision. We know that around 12,000 years ago, the position of Earth's axis placed the pole star not where it is today, but in a different part of the sky. We know that constellations look slightly different from their present forms, stretched across the heavens in positions that would seem unfamiliar to us. Yet we also know that people tracked these differences, that the first observatories and alignments of stones to the heavens may have begun during this time. When people built stone circles or aligned settlements with solstices and equinoxes, they were not only marking the passage of time, but preserving the memory of where the heavens stood. It is worth imagining how a community might have experienced this. Each generation, elders pointed to the stars, teaching their children the stories that gave meaning to the night sky. Those children grew up, noticed the stars were not quite where they were supposed to be, and asked questions. The elders responded with new stories, new interpretations, weaving change into tradition. In this way, the heavens were both a reminder of continuity and of impermanence. The shifting of stars after the flood also served as metaphors for human life. Just as coastlines vanished and animals disappeared, so too did the heavens remind people that nothing is fixed. But just as rivers found new courses and forests regrew, the stars reminded them that new patterns always emerge, new stories always take shape. The sky was a mirror of Earth's transformations, and by watching it, people understood that change was not only loss, but renewal. Even today, when we look at ancient monuments like Stonehenge, Göbekli Tepe, or the alignments of pyramids, we see traces of this deep connection between earth and sky. These sites may be younger than the flood itself, but they reflect traditions that began in those earlier days. People who saw the heavens shift carried with them the idea that aligning life with the cosmos mattered, that the sky was not separate from the land but bound to it. That idea was born when seas rose, when lands changed, when stars themselves seemed to move. So, after the flood, when people lifted their eyes, they did not see the same sky as before. They saw constellations shifted, tides altered, stories rewritten in light. They saw a reminder that the universe itself was alive with change. And just as they adapted to forests, rivers and animals, they adapted to the heavens, carrying forward not only survival on Earth, but understanding of the cosmos above. As the waters withdrew into their new boundaries and the Earth settled into the shape we recognise today, the evidence of those floods and upheavals did not vanish. It remained scattered across the land, hidden in the most unlikely places. High in mountains, far from any shoreline, shells and corals could be found pressed into the stone. On ridges and cliffs, layers of sediment told of ancient seas that once covered them, and carved into rock, painted on walls, arranged in monuments, were the stories of people who had witnessed the changes. Seashells on mountains, stories in stone. These became the enduring records of a world remade, testaments to memory that outlived the generations who lived through it. Imagine climbing a mountain thousands of years ago with your community, perhaps in search of game or to gather stone for tools, and finding embedded in the rock the fossilized remains of seashells. They look like the ones you might gather along the shore, yet here they are, far from any ocean, trapped in the mountain itself. For ancient people, the discovery must have seemed like a mystery, even a miracle. How could creatures of the sea be found so high above the waves? What did it mean? Many cultures later interpreted such findings as proof of great floods, divine acts, or worlds destroyed and remade. They were not wrong. Those shells were indeed evidence of oceans that had once covered lands now raised high. They were geological truth, carried into myth and story. Geologists today know that mountain seashells are the remnants of ancient seabeds, lifted by tectonic forces over millions of years. But to the people who first stumbled upon them after the Ice Age floods, they would have seemed like messages, markers of the water's power. When you live through a deluge that drowns your valleys and swallows your fields, finding seashells on mountains reinforces the sense that the earth itself can transform in ways beyond comprehension. It told them the sea had been here before, that it could return again, and that nothing was truly safe from its reach. Stories in stone took other forms as well. Carvings and paintings made by early communities often depicted waves, rivers, animals and boats. At Göbekli Tepe in what is now Turkey, some of the world's earliest known monumental carvings, dating back to around 11,000 years ago, show animals and symbols that some researchers believe may reference environmental changes and cosmic events. While interpretations vary, it is hard not to see these carvings as echoes of a world adjusting to profound shifts in climate and landscape. The stones themselves became storytellers, holding memory for generations. Caves, too, served as canvases for memory. In some, people painted not only animals and hunts, but flowing shapes that resemble water, waves, or storms. These images may have been more than art. They may have been records, reminders of floods that swept across the land, of rivers that changed their course, of seas that consumed familiar ground. For communities without writing, stone was the most enduring medium. Unlike words spoken or even wood carved, stone endured. What was marked into it could last for thousands of years, surviving long after those who carved it were gone. Monuments aligned with rivers, with solstices, with the stars also reflected the memory of a water. To build in stone was to create permanence, a counterweight to the impermanence of the flood. By carving, stacking and arranging stone, people declared that some things could endure even when rivers changed their paths. The very act of building in stone may have been shaped by the trauma of loss, an effort to root culture in something the waters could not sweep away. Even oral traditions, though not carved in stone, often carried references to physical features of the land that matched geological evidence. Aboriginal stories in Australia describe places now underwater with astonishing accuracy, recounting bays, rivers, and landmarks that have been confirmed by modern mapping. These stories are memory fossilised in language, as enduring in their way as seashells pressed into mountain stone. For those who told them, the land itself was the record, and words were the key to reading it. Consider how a child might have been taught in these times. An elder points to a cliff face where shells gleam in the rock, explaining that this was once covered by ocean. The lesson is not only about the past, but about respect for the forces of nature. Another elder leads the child to a carved stone, telling the story of how their people survived when the waters rose. In this way, stone became a book, shells became symbols, and the land itself a library of memory. What is remarkable is how much of this has survived. We can still see the fossils on mountains, the carvings on ancient pillars, the paintings in caves. They connect us directly to those who lived through the transformations of 12,000 years ago. When we look at them, we are not only studying geology or archaeology, we are hearing voices across time, voices that say, "We saw the sea here, we remembered." The presence of seashells on mountains also inspired some of the earliest philosophical questions. In ancient Greece, thinkers puzzled over how marine fossils could be found inland. Some suggested that the land had once been underwater, others that the sea had risen and fallen in cycles. These were profound insights, born not only from observation, but from the inheritance of much older stories told by those who had lived through floods. The shells were not just curiosities, they were evidence, leading to some of humanity's first attempts to understand the Earth as a changing dynamic system. For people living in the aftermath of the Great Flood, every shell in stone, every carving of water, every story etched into rock was a reassurance that memory could endure. The land had been reshaped, but the evidence was there for anyone who cared to look. It was a way of anchoring identity in a world where rivers shifted, forests grew and died, animals vanished and seas rose. In stone and shell, they found continuity. It is easy to underestimate how powerful that sense of continuity must have been. Imagine watching your homeland disappear underwater, and then finding a fossilized shell on a mountain ridge. You realize that others before you also lived through rising seas, that the ocean had claimed the land before and might do so again. The shell is a warning, but it is also a connection to the deep past. It tells you that survival is possible, that you are part of a much longer story. And so the seashells on mountains and the stories in stone became more than curiosities. They were the anchors of memory, the evidence of transformation, the proof that Earth itself was alive and shifting. They reminded people that nothing is permanent, but that memory, if carved deep enough, could last. Even now, when we find them, they whisper the same truth. When waters reshape the land, they reshape memory too. People do not simply move on from floods that drown their homes, their fields, their burial sites. They carry those memories with them, retelling them in ways that give shape to the past and meaning to the present. Every culture that lived through the rising seas found ways to remember, and those ways were as varied as the people themselves. Some carved memories into stone, some sang them in songs, some embedded them in myths, while others wove them into daily rituals. These memories endured not as detached history, but as living traditions, carried forward across generations. In Mesopotamia, one of the oldest centres of human settlement, the story of a great flood became a cornerstone of culture. The tale recorded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Utnapishtim survived a deluge that destroyed the world, is not just a story of disaster, but of continuity. It explains why humanity still exists, why seeds still sprout, why life continues even after catastrophe. The memory of rising waters was preserved as both warning and reassurance, teaching that though the world may be swept clean, survival is possible if wisdom is followed. Farther east in the lands of India, the story of Manu and the cosmic fish preserved memory in a different form. The warning of the fish, the building of the boat, the carrying of seeds, all speak to a recognition that floods can both destroy and renew. The tale encodes practical wisdom: save your seeds, protect your animals, prepare for cycles of destruction, while also offering spiritual meaning. Floods are not just natural events, they're woven into the cosmic order, a part of creation itself. In the Pacific, island peoples remembered floods in songs and navigation stories. Rising seas were not abstract events, but daily realities, shaping which islands were habitable, which coasts disappeared. Stories of gods who lifted islands from the sea, or who sank them when angered, are echoes of real experiences of watching land vanish or appear. These stories guided not only spiritual life, but practical choices about when to travel, where to settle, and how to survive on shifting coasts. For cultures whose lives depended on the ocean, memory of floods was woven directly into the art of seafaring. Among indigenous peoples of the Americas, flood stories are numerous and varied. In the north, the Ojibwe told of a world drowned, where animals worked together to bring mud from beneath the waters to rebuild land. In the southwest, the Hopi remembered floods as part of cycles of destruction that cleanse the world when balance is lost. In Mesoamerica, Mayan traditions describe earlier worlds destroyed by water before the current one was formed. These stories are not only myths, they're ways of remembering the vulnerability of human life before the forces of nature. They teach cooperation, humility, and resilience, values necessary in a world where rivers and seas could change everything. Australia offers some of the most direct connections between memory and geology. Aboriginal traditions contain detailed accounts of coastlines now underwater, passed down for thousands of years. Some stories describe bays and rivers that modern science has confirmed were drowned around 7,000 years ago. The fact that such stories endured for millennia shows the power of oral tradition to preserve memory far beyond written records. For these cultures, remembering the waters was not about creating myths separate from reality, but about passing on knowledge of real changes to the land so that future generations could understand and adapt. In Northern Europe, flood memories became embedded in folklore. Tales of spirits living in lakes, of drowned lands beneath the sea, of bells that could still be heard from sunken churches, all reflect a cultural awareness that water could claim what was once solid ground. In Britain, legends of Lyonesse, a land said to have sunk beneath the waves near Cornwall, echo the real drowning of Doggerland. These stories kept alive the sense that the sea is both giver and taker, always capable of erasing human settlements. Rituals also carried memory. Many ancient cultures practiced offerings to rivers and seas, casting food, tools, or even human sacrifices into the waters. These rituals can be seen as acts of respect, ways of acknowledging the power of water to give life or to take it away. They may also reflect memory, an awareness that water had once taken much and could again. By honouring the waters, people sought to maintain balance to ensure that floods would not return in destructive ways. The physical landscape itself often became a kind of memorial. High ground where survivors once fled became sacred sites. Hills or mountains associated with safety during floods were revered as holy places, sites of temples or shrines. Rivers that once overflowed were treated with caution and respect, their banks avoided for settlement. These patterns of behaviour preserved memory and practice, even when stories faded. To live in certain places or avoid others was itself a way of remembering. Art too played its role. Pottery painted with wave patterns, carvings of boats, figurines of fish and water creatures, all can be seen as echoes of the flood in material culture. Even if the stories are lost, the symbols endure. silent reminders of what mattered most to the people who shaped them. Art carries memory in ways words cannot, across distances and generations, surviving even when languages change or vanish. The act of remembering the waters also shaped how cultures thought about time. Floods were not seen as singular, unique events, but as part of cycles. Just as the rains came each year, just as rivers rose and fell with the seasons, so too could great floods come and go over the ages. This cyclical view of time, common in many ancient cultures, may be rooted in the memory of repeated inundations. Life was not a straight line from beginning to end, but a series of renewals, cleansings, and rebirths. The memory of floods reinforced this worldview, embedding it deep in cultural consciousness. It is striking how consistent the themes are across cultures: destruction, survival, renewal, warnings ignored or heeded, a chosen survivor carrying seeds, animals, or wisdom into a new world. These patterns suggest not only shared experiences but shared lessons. Cultures remembered the waters not only to recall what was lost, but to teach how to endure what might come again. In this way, memory became a tool for survival, ensuring that future generations would not be unprepared when rivers rose or storms swept in. Modern science often confirms what these memories preserved. We can see in geological records the evidence of floods, in drowned coastlines the proof of rising seas, in fossils the traces of vanished lands. But the stories add something science cannot provide: the human perspective. They tell us how it felt, what it meant, how people made sense of the overwhelming. They show us not just the facts of history, but its meaning for those who lived it. When we hear these stories today, they connect us not only to the past, but to the present. We too live in a world where waters are rising, where coasts are shifting, where floods reshape lives. Remembering how ancient cultures carried their memories of the waters reminds us that we are part of a much longer story. We are not the first to face seas that encroach or rivers that overflow. The difference is that we have their stories to guide us, if we choose to listen. And so, the memory of floods has never truly faded. It lives in myths, in rituals, in art, in landscapes, in oral traditions, and even in the shells embedded in stone. It reminds us that the waters came before, that they changed everything, and that they can come again. By remembering, cultures gave meaning to loss and resilience to survival. The waters were never forgotten. They were carried in story, in practice, and in spirit, shaping humanity long after the floods themselves had passed. When seas rose after the Ice Age and rivers carried their swollen waters into valleys, the earth did not only change on the surface, it kept a record of those changes in layers of mud, sand, gravel and stone. Every shoreline that shifted left behind traces, every flood deposited sediments that told of its passing, every retreat of ice carved new patterns into the land. These quiet records have become one of the greatest sources of knowledge about what happened 12,000 years ago. Where stories and myths preserve memory through words, the earth itself preserved it in layers, waiting for us to learn how to read them. Picture a river swollen with glacial melt. It carries with it silt, stones, and even boulders, grinding them along as it rushes downhill. When the river slows, spreading into a plain or emptying into a lake, those sediments settle, forming layers. Over time, flood after flood, year after year, those layers build, like pages in a book. Centuries later, scientists can dig into those layers and see the sequence. A band of fine silt from a calm season, a thick deposit of sand from a flood, a scatter of pebbles marking an especially violent surge. Each layer is a record, a frozen moment in the story of water and land. At the edges of seas, shorelines tell their own stories. As waters rose, waves carved cliffs, left behind beach ridges, and deposited shells and sand in places where land once stretched further. In some parts of the world, ancient shorelines are still visible, lying like scars on hillsides, miles from today's coasts. These raised beaches show where the sea once stood, offering proof of how far it advanced before retreating. In other places, drowned shorelines can be mapped beneath the waves with sonar, tracing ancient bays and river mouths now hidden underwater. The science of shorelines is, in many ways, the science of memory, learning how to see what the sea has hidden. One of the most dramatic examples of sedimentary records comes from Lake Agassiz, a massive glacial lake that once covered parts of Canada and the northern United States. When its ice dams broke, torrents of water poured into the Atlantic, altering ocean currents and perhaps even triggering the Younger Dryas cold period. The sediments left behind in valleys, in riverbeds, in ocean floors still tell of those catastrophic outflows. Thick deposits of gravel mark where torrents rushed through channels, while fine clays settled in quiet waters farther downstream. By reading these sediments, scientists can reconstruct floods that no human eye witnessed directly, revealing how water reshaped continents in moments of release. In coastal areas, sediments preserve the rhythm of rising seas. In deltas like the Nile, the Mississippi or the Ganges, layers of silt build outward as rivers deposit material into the ocean. Each layer marks a year, a season, a flood. Cores taken from these deltas are like timelines, showing not only the rise of seas but the changes in climate, vegetation and even human activity. Charcoal layers speak of fires set by people to clear land. Pollen grains reveal which plants grew nearby. Tiny shells record the salinity of waters, showing when the sea advanced into river valleys. In this way, sediments do more than tell of floods. They tell of life itself, woven into the land. Shorelines hold another kind of record, the story of human presence. Archaeologists often find ancient tools, hearths and campsites along now drowned coasts. These sites are windows into lives lived at the edge of land and sea. As waters rose, many were submerged, but some remain preserved under layers of sediment, waiting to be uncovered. Each discovery adds detail to the story of how people lived through the transition. A hearth buried under sand tells of a meal eaten before the sea claimed the land. A scatter of stone flakes shows where tools were made along a riverbank that no longer exists. These remnants connect the science of shorelines to the lived experience of people. The study of sediments has also revealed sudden catastrophic floods beyond the slow rise of seas. In the Pacific Northwest of North America, for example, evidence shows that massive floods swept across the land when ice dams holding back glacial Lake Missoula burst. Walls of water hundreds of feet high carved valleys, moved boulders the size of houses, and left behind ripple marks so large they can still be seen from the air. These marks, preserved in stone and soil, are silent records of floods that dwarfed anything in human memory. For centuries no one could imagine water so powerful. Only by studying sediments did scientists uncover the scale of these events. In Scandinavia and northern Europe, raised shorelines tell of land rebounding after glaciers melted. The weight of the ice had pressed the land down, and when it lifted, the land slowly rose, creating ancient beaches now far inland. These raised beaches are more than geological curiosities. They are evidence of the dynamic interplay between ice, water, and rock. They also reveal how complex the flood story was, not simply seas rising, but land itself shifting, tilting, and reshaping as the balance of the earth changed. Sediments even record the atmosphere of the past. Dust trapped in layers of ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica shows how winds shifted, how volcanic eruptions spread ash, how climates warmed or cooled. The Younger Dryas appears in these records as a sudden return of dustier, colder conditions, preserved in the ice like ink on a page. Together with sediments on land and shorelines in the sea, these ice layers give us a global picture of what was happening 12,000 years ago. For people of that time, of course, there was no science of sediments or shorelines. They lived the floods, saw the rivers rise, watched the coasts disappear. But unknowingly, they left their traces in the same layers we now study. Fires they lit left charcoal. Fields they cleared left pollen signatures. fish bones discarded in camps became buried in silt. Without meaning to, they wrote their own stories into the sediments, where we can now find them. The science of sediments and shorelines is, in a sense, an act of listening. Listening to the earth tell its own story, patient and precise. It requires seeing in mud and stone what others might overlook, piecing together the fragments of a world remade by water, and what it reveals is not only the scale of the flood, but the resilience of life. In every layer of destruction lies also the record of renewal, plants returning, animals adapting, humans finding new ways to endure. It is striking how closely the scientific record matches the cultural memories preserved in myth. Where stories speak of floods, sediments show evidence of deluges. Where tales tell of vanished lands, drowned shorelines confirm the loss. Where rituals honoured rivers and seas, cores from deltas show how those waters shaped life. Science and story, sediment and memory, shoreline and myth, they are not opposed but complementary, two ways of remembering the same events. When we look at sediments today, we see more than geology. We see the fingerprints of the Great Flood, the layers of its passing, the traces of its aftermath. And when we stand on ancient shorelines, raised high or drowned deep, we stand at the boundaries of memory, where the earth itself remembers, just as people once did in story and song. The science of sediment and shorelines is, in the end, the science of how the planet writes its own history and how we learn to read it. When waters rose and ice withdrew, when animals vanished and climates lurched between warmth and cold, one truth revealed itself again and again. Survival belongs to those who adapt. The earth has always been a place of upheaval, and yet life persists. From the smallest insect to the tallest tree, from herds of deer returning to the plains to the humans learning to plant seeds in soil, survival after the flood was not about holding on to the old, but about finding ways to thrive in the new. This spirit of adaptation defined the world 12,000 years ago, and it remains part of who we are today. Consider the plants. As glaciers retreated, they were the first to reclaim the land. Mosses and lichens crept across bare stone, breaking it down, creating the beginnings of soil. Grasses followed, their roots binding the earth, preparing it for larger plants. Then came shrubs, then trees, each step building on what came before. Forests spread into lands once frozen, carrying with them birds, insects and mammals. The resilience of plants, their ability to take root in the harshest conditions, transformed the earth into a green world once more. Their quiet persistence laid the foundation for everything else that followed. Animals, too, proved their resilience. Though many great species disappeared, the mammoth, the saber-tooth, the giant ground sloth, others adapted. Deer, elk and bison spread across the open plains, thriving where giants had fallen. Wolves adjusted to new prey, hunting smaller animals with the same persistence that once carried them against mammoths. Birds shifted their ranges, filling skies that had been silent during the cold. Fish swam up rivers newly carved by meltwater, populating lakes that had never existed before. Every ecosystem became a story of survivors, creatures that found ways to fit into landscapes transformed by water and ice. Humans were perhaps the greatest adapters of all. Where some animals could only live in certain climates, people could live almost anywhere. They built shelters to survive the cold, lit fires to keep predators at bay, fashioned clothes to endure the elements. After the flood, they learned to fish in swollen rivers, to gather from forests, to plant crops in fertile valleys. They turned a loss into opportunity, transforming the disappearance of great game into the birth of agriculture, turning migration into settlement, turning uncertainty into innovation. Humanity's strength was never brute force but flexibility, the ability to imagine and create new solutions. This spirit of adaptation was not only practical but cultural. Communities reshaped their traditions to suit new landscapes. Myths of floods gave meaning to rising seas. Rituals honoured rivers that had once destroyed but now sustained. Stories of ancestors who survived taught children that resilience was part of who they were. In this way, survival was not just physical, it was mental, emotional, and spiritual. People endured not only by changing how they lived, but by changing how they thought about the world around them. Adaptation also meant cooperation. In times of abundance, groups could live apart, relying on their own hunting grounds. But after the flood, when coasts vanished and herds moved unpredictably, cooperation became essential. Knowledge was shared, tools were traded, food was exchanged. Communities learned from one another, carrying ideas across rivers and mountains. The spread of farming, of pottery, of new hunting techniques, all depended on this exchange. Survival was never a solitary act. It was collective, built on the strength of shared wisdom. What is remarkable is that adaptation did not always mean progress in a straight line. Some groups embraced farming and settlement. Others continued to live as hunters and gatherers. Some moved to the coasts, learning to fish and sail, while others stayed inland, following herds. Each strategy was valid, shaped by environment and need. There was no single way to survive after the flood. There were countless ways, each reflecting the ingenuity of people in different places. This diversity itself was a form of resilience, ensuring that humanity as a whole could endure no matter what changes came. The memory of adaptation can be seen in the traces left behind. Tools evolve from heavy blades suited to large animals to finer points for hunting smaller game. Pottery appears where food storage becomes vital. Fields and irrigation lines mark the beginnings of farming. Villages show the growth of settlement. Each of these changes is not sudden but gradual, the result of countless small choices made by individuals and families trying to find stability. Survival is rarely dramatic. It is 1,000 small adjustments, carried out day after day, generation after generation. Animals adapted in their own ways, often in partnership with humans. Dogs, once wolves, became companions, guards, and hunters' aids. Goats and sheep, once wild, became domesticated, offering steady sources of food and fibre. Later, cattle and pigs joined them. These animals too were survivors, finding safety and abundance alongside humans. The relationships forged in those early days of adaptation remain with us, reminders that survival on this planet has always been shared. The resilience of rivers shows another side of adaptation. Though floods reshaped valleys, rivers did not vanish. They found new paths, carved new courses, created new deltas. They adapted to rising seas by pushing sediments farther out, by building new floodplains, by nourishing new ecosystems. Lakes filled with life, wetlands became nurseries for fish and birds, deltas supported fertile soil. The very waters that once destroyed became the waters that sustained. The cycle of adaptation was not only human or animal, but planetary. In thinking of adaptation, it is important to remember that it is not only about survival, but about growth. After the flood, people did not merely cling to existence. They flourished. Populations grew, villages expanded, new technologies appeared. Forests spread, animals multiplied, rivers enriched the land. Out of upheaval came abundance, because life has a way of not only enduring but expanding when given the chance. This is the deeper lesson of adaptation. It is not only about resisting loss, but about seizing opportunity. For the people of 12,000 years ago, adaptation was not optional. It was the only way forward. Yet in adapting, they laid the foundation for everything that followed. Farming, cities, civilizations. Without their resilience, without their willingness to change, we would not be here today. Their story is our story, written in the landscapes they transformed and the traditions they passed on. And so, the world after the Great Flood became a world of survivors, always adapting. Plants, animals, rivers, and humans alike found ways to fit into a planet reshaped by water. The lesson was clear. Nothing stays the same, but life endures. That truth is as relevant now as it was then. The Earth changes, but we change with it, carrying forward the spirit of resilience that has always defined life on this planet. When people looked back on the waters that had swallowed valleys, erased coasts, and scattered families, they did not only remember what was lost, they also learned. The floods of 12,000 years ago carried with them lessons that endured long after the waters had settled. Lessons woven into stories, rituals, landscapes, and ways of life. Some were practical, born of hard survival. Others were spiritual, born of reflection on forces too large to fully grasp. Together, they became part of the deep inheritance of humanity, shaping how people thought about the world and their place in it. The first lesson was about impermanence. For countless generations before the floods, people had lived on plains and in valleys that seemed eternal. Rivers flowed along familiar paths, coasts stretched where they always had, animals moved along predictable routes. The deluge shattered that illusion. Land that seemed permanent vanished. Forests drowned. Rivers shifted their beds. The lesson was clear. Nothing on Earth remains unchanged. This recognition, preserved in myth and ritual, became a warning passed on to later generations, that even the ground beneath one's feet can move, that permanence is an illusion. The second lesson was about resilience. Floods brought destruction, but they also revealed the strength of those who survived. People learned that they could endure loss, rebuild, and begin again. They carried seeds to new lands, built homes farther inland, shifted diets when old food sources disappeared. Myths of chosen survivors, of boats filled with life, of lands rebuilt after drowning, are not just stories of catastrophe, they are stories of resilience. They taught that survival was possible, even when the world seemed to end. A third lesson was about preparation. In many flood myths, a warning is given, by a god, a spirit, a wise ancestor, or by careful observation of signs in nature. Those who listen survive. Those who ignore the warning perish. These stories are not only spiritual, they encode practical wisdom. Pay attention to the signs, watch the rivers, listen to the land, prepare when danger is near. Such lessons, told through myth, ensured that future generations would be more attentive, more cautious, more ready for the unexpected. The fourth lesson was about balance with nature. The flood reminded humanity that they were not separate from the earth but deeply dependent on it. When rivers rose or seas advanced, there was no choice but to adapt. This humility found expression in rituals honouring water, in offerings to rivers, in prayers to seas. The recognition that nature could give or take away shaped early religion, early philosophy, and early practice. To live in balance with water became not only a survival strategy, but a cultural value. The fifth lesson lay in memory itself. Floods taught people the importance of remembering and of passing on knowledge. Without writing, memory was carried in story, in song, in carvings, in alignments of stone. To forget was to risk being unprepared when waters rose again. To remember was to protect future generations. The persistence of flood myths across cultures shows how deeply this lesson was learned. The stories were not mere entertainment, they were vessels of survival, ensuring that even thousands of years later, people would not forget the power of water. But there were also subtler lessons. One was about opportunity. Floods destroyed, but they also created fertile land. As rivers spread silt across valleys, they enriched the soil. As seas advanced, they created new coasts filled with fish and shellfish. People who learned to see opportunity in change thrived. The shift to farming may itself be one of these lessons. When wild foods became scarce, people turned to planting seeds, transforming necessity into innovation. The flood was both loss and possibility, teaching that adaptation could bring abundance. Another subtle lesson was about community. Floods displaced families, forcing them to seek safety together, to rely on one another, to share resources. Out of catastrophe came stronger bonds. Cooperation, trade, and exchange grew as people moved into new lands. The sense that survival depended not only on individual skill, but on collective effort became part of cultural memory. This lesson carried forward, laying the foundation for larger communities, for villages, and eventually for civilizations. There were also lessons about humility before forces greater than oneself. The flood was beyond human control. No tool, no weapon, no skill could stop the rising seas. People could only adapt, never resist. This recognition shaped worldviews in which gods or spirits were seen as holding immense power, in which humans accepted their vulnerability. Even as people learned to farm, to tame animals, to reshape the land, the memory of the flood reminded them that there were limits, that nature itself could not be mastered. The lessons hidden in the ancient floods are still with us, though often unrecognised. They echo in the ways we build near rivers, in the rituals still performed for rain or calm seas, in the respect many cultures retain for water as both life and danger. They echo in our fascination with myths of deluge, from Noah to Manu to Deucalion, stories retold across millennia because their core lessons remain relevant. They echo in science too, in the study of sediments, shorelines and ice cores, which teach us once again that water shapes our world and that change is constant. Imagine a family thousands of years ago telling their children the story of how their ancestors survived the waters. They sit near a fire, their home newly built on higher ground. The children listen wide-eyed as their elders explain that once, where they now sit, the sea had advanced, drowning villages. They hear that the people who came before paid attention, carried seeds, found safety, and endured. The story is not only about the past, but about teaching the children how to live. That is the essence of the lessons of the flood. They are not history alone, but guidance for the future. Even now, when we study those floods through science, we are uncovering lessons. We learn that sudden climate shifts can happen, that sea levels can rise dramatically, that entire regions can be transformed. We learn that ecosystems can collapse but also rebound, that humans can suffer loss but also innovate. We learn that resilience is not optional. It is the condition of life itself. These are the same lessons our ancestors carried, though we frame them differently. The floods of 12,000 years ago are gone, but the wisdom they gave remains. They remind us that the earth is never still, that we must always be ready to change, that survival depends on memory, cooperation, humility, and resilience. The waters may rise again in different ways, but the lessons endure. They are hidden not only in sediments and shorelines, but in our stories, our cultures, our very sense of who we are. To listen to them is to remember that we too are part of a planet that survives by adapting. Thank you for walking this long path with me. We've wandered together through the earth after the Great Flood, through forests reborn and rivers swollen, through animals returning and humans learning to plant seeds, through myths and stones, and the slow memory of shorelines. Now, as we come toward the close of this story, it's worth pausing for a moment, not to declare an ending, but to feel how the tide of memory and dream carries forward from then to now. The flood of 12,000 years ago may feel like a distant shadow, a geologic event tucked away in the deep past, but the truth is that it lingers in ways both quiet and profound. It lingers in the stories still told of waters rising, of boats carrying life, of survivors rebuilding. It lingers in the very landscapes we inhabit, the coasts carved by ancient seas, the deltas enriched by floods, the mountains holding fossils of oceans long gone. It lingers in our imagination, where the idea of the world drowned and renewed carries both fear and fascination. Even if we no longer live as hunters on the edge of shrinking ice, the memory of those times remains in the cultures we inherit. Think of the myths we've carried through this journey. Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim, Manu and the fish, Deucalion and Pyrrha, the Ojibwe animals diving for mud, the Hopi cycles of destruction and renewal, the Polynesian canoes sailing over drowned lands. Each of these stories is like a wave, carrying fragments of memory across oceans of time. They are not identical, but together they form a pattern, one that speaks of survival, of loss, of beginnings. In telling them, people did more than preserve memory. They transformed memory into dream, into meaning. And meaning, unlike stone or soil, cannot be washed away so easily. The flood also lingers in the sciences we practice today. When we drill into sediments, map drowned coasts, or study the tilt of the Earth, we are listening to the planet's own record of its past. We discover that our ancestors were not mistaken when they said the seas had risen, that lands had vanished. They were witnesses, and we now confirm what they preserved in story. The partnership between myth and science is one of the most remarkable threads of this entire tale. The one holds the human truth, the other the geologic. Together they remind us that the world we inhabit is not fixed but shifting, always in flux, always becoming. If there is one thread that runs through all of it, it is resilience. The resilience of plants that regrew in barren soil. The resilience of animals that filled the niches left behind. The resilience of people who lost much yet built anew, who turned scarcity into invention, who carried memory forward. The flood was not the end of humanity, but the beginning of a new age. Without the resilience learned in those years, the story of farming, of villages, of civilizations would never have followed. There is also humility here. For all that humans achieved after the flood, for all the seeds planted, animals tamed, stones carved, the waters were a reminder of limits. The earth is larger than us, its force is stronger than any one community. That humility was woven into rituals, into respect for rivers and seas, into the understanding that life depends on balance. The survivors of the flood carried not only new skills but a new awareness, that to endure, one must live in rhythm with the planet, not in opposition to it. At the same time, there is opportunity. Floods destroyed, but they also created. They carved fertile valleys, filled lakes with fish, spread nutrients across plains. They pushed people to experiment, to create new tools, to build new ways of living. Out of devastation came growth, and out of growth came the beginnings of the world we now know. Opportunity hidden in loss is perhaps the most enduring lesson of all. It's worth asking why these stories still hold us. Why do tales of great floods remain powerful thousands of years later? Perhaps it is because we live always with water close by, always with rivers at our doors, seas at our edges, rains above us. Water is life, but water is also loss, and somewhere in our memory we know this. The flood myths do not only speak of the past, they speak of the ever-present truth that we live at the boundary between land and water, and that boundary is never entirely secure. When we think of the world today, with seas rising again, with coasts vulnerable, with storms more powerful, the echoes of the ancient flood seem louder. We are not the first to face such changes. Others lived through them, adapted, and remembered. Their lessons are still with us. Pay attention to the signs, live with humility, adapt when the world shifts, and carry memory forward. These lessons are not relics. They are guides, still relevant, still urgent. Imagine for a moment standing at the shore at night. The tide laps at the sand, the moon glimmers on the water, the stars stretch overhead. Somewhere beneath those waves there may lie a village drowned 12,000 years ago, its fires long extinguished, its stones scattered, and yet in a way, those people are not gone. Their resilience is in us, their stories are in our myths, their lessons are in our traditions. The tide carries not only water, but memory. Memory carried forward through us. And just as memory flows forward, so too does dream. The people who survived the flood did not only remember the past, They dreamed of the future. They dreamed of fields planted and harvested, of villages safe from waters, of children growing into a world less uncertain. Their dreams built the foundations of history. We too dream of coasts still standing, of rivers providing, of a balance between land, water and life. The tide of memory and dream is unbroken, linking us to those who once watched the seas rise and who found, against all odds, a way to endure. So as we close this story, let it not feel like an ending, but like another tide, another wave moving onward. The floods of 12,000 years ago were not the last, nor were they the first. They were one part of the larger rhythm of Earth, a rhythm of change, of destruction and renewal. The people who lived through them left us more than myths. They left us guidance, resilience, humility and hope. That is the true tide, the one that carries not only water but meaning, not only memory but dream. And with that, thank you for being here, for listening, for walking this long journey into the deep past. If you found this soothing, if the story of ancient waters has given you something to reflect on, I invite you to join me again here at Just About Earth. Like the tide, we will return, with new stories, new journeys, new echoes of the world we all share. Until then, may the rhythm of the earth steady you. May the tide of memory carry you gently forward, and may the dream of endurance remain always with you.